All right. Thank you for joining me on this episode of The Gospel Truth. I'm your host, Marlon Wilson, and we have another great show for you today. I have Dr. Dale Tuggy and Anthony Rogers with me, and we're going to be debating, does the book of Mark teach that Jesus is the one true God? So we have an exciting show for you, a great debate planned, and I thank you for joining me on this episode of The Gospel Truth. As always, I do want to go and encourage you to like and follow The Gospel Truth. Make sure you hit that like, make sure you hit that subscribe, make sure you hit that notification bell, wherever you're watching this debate, Facebook, YouTube, wherever you are, make sure you hit that notification bell so you can stay in the loop with what the Gospel Truth has going on. Also, this content is on podcast, so make sure you're flowing to iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and Spotify to make sure that you are getting in with the podcast. All right. Some of you guys don't like the YouTube thing. You guys are always on the go, so that option is available for you, just in case you'd like to rather listen to the podcast. Also, as I mentioned, the social media platforms. I'm also on Instagram and Twitter, so make sure that you are flowing over there and subscribing there to stay in the loop with what the Gospel Truth has going on over there as well. That said, let me go ahead and go over a couple of announcements of shows that I have coming up here in the future. All right, coming up here on Tuesday, February 2nd, I have an interview answering objections to the canon of the New Testament. I have Jonathan Sheffield, so make sure you are hitting that notification bell for that one so you can hear that one live. After that, I have Pastor Emilio Ramos is going to be joining me, and we're going to be going through Romans chapter 9. So this is going to be a great debate, not debate, but an interview. I'm so used to saying debates, but this is going to be a great interview, and I'm pretty excited about this one. This should be a great one, so make sure you be on the lookout for that one. That's coming up February 4th at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. After that, I have Robert Weisner, Predestination and Election in the Second Temple Judaism in relation to Pauline theology. So that's going to be an excellent discussion. I'm looking forward to this one. This is coming up Tuesday, February 9th at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. That's 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then lastly, I have my buddy. We're going to go in here. We're going to talk about, we got to duke it out over this one, man. My buddy's a Calvinist, and I believe he can hold the liberty and free will. So we're going to have a great discussion in this one. I love talking to JD. This is my guy. And Calvinists hold the libertarian free will. So be on the lookout for this interview and the discussion. So if you are interested to know what the Gospel Truth has going on, you're on that YouTube page. We have a whole bunch of live shows that are coming up. So please, I cannot emphasize it enough to make sure that you're subscribing. If you're on Facebook, make sure you're liking on both of those platforms. Make sure you hit the notification bell so you will not miss out on any shows coming up here in the future. That said, I have Dr. Dale Tuggy and Anthony Rogers. Dr. Dale Tuggy's been on the show before. He debated Dr. Sean Cole, and it was concerning the Trinity. And that was a great debate, a great discussion. If you haven't checked that out, I will be posting a link to that debate in the live chat comments so you can check that one out. But that was a great discussion, and I'm glad to have Dr. Dale Tuggy back for this one. And I also have Anthony Rogers. Anthony Rogers was supposed to come on a long time ago, man. I should have been got Anthony Rogers on, man. I can't be missing out on this guy. I mean, this guy's a beast, man. So I'm so glad both of these guys have joined me. Let me bring these guys in so they can introduce yourself to you guys. What's up, guys? How y'all doing? Y'all doing all right?
Very good, thanks.
Y'all ready to get this show on the roll? Y'all ready?
Absolutely.
Ready.
You guys decided to jump. So Dr. Dale Tuggy, you started to jump back in to the Gospel Truth Octagon, man. That's what I call it, man. The Gospel Truth Octagon,
okay.
Man. You know what I mean? We about to get this show on the road, man. And Anthony,
right.
This is your first go round, man. So I'm glad you came, man. And I'm excited for this one. The audience is excited for this one. So Dr. Dale Tuggy, tell me a little bit about what you got going on, man. What you got?
What's going on? Well, I live in Tennessee with my family. I work a non-academic job now. I was a professor for 18 years at State University of New York, but I quit that. A lot of my time is taken up doing my Trinities podcast, and I also have the privilege of serving as chair of the board of the Unitarian Christian Alliance. That's about it.
All right. Anthony, man, what you got going on, man? Give a quick introduction to yourself, man.
Sure. First, I'd like to give all praise and thanks to the Lord Jesus Christ, who loved me and gave himself for me. I am a pastor of prison ministries. I serve as the regional director in South Carolina for Metanoia Prison Ministries. Metanoia fittingly means repentance, good name for a prison ministry. I also do various other jobs and love to engage in evangelism and apologetics. So for a long time, I've done apologetic type stuff. I especially focus on Muslims, but have also done quite a number of things with Unitarians. So I'm looking forward to this with Dale.
All right, all right. All right, cool, guys. So we're going to jump into this, man. Once again, the topic of this debate is does the Book of Mormon teach that Jesus is Book of Mormon? I said Book of Mormon, you guys. The Book of Mark teach that Jesus is the one true God. So Anthony, you're arguing the affirmative in this debate. They'll tell you you're arguing the negative. So the format of this debate, we're going to have 15-minute opening statements. That's going to be followed by a 10-minute rebuttal. And then we're going to have another rebuttal of 5 minutes. That's going to be followed by a 50-minute cross-examination where the first 30 minutes, both of you will get 15 minutes each to ask questions. I'm going to be pretty strict on that. As the interlocutor, as a person asks a question, I expect the opponent to answer the question. And then after that, we're going to have more of a 20-minute opening statement to close out that cross-examination portion. That's going to be followed by a 5-minute closing, and then we have Q&A from the audience. Sounds good?
Sounds good.
Yep.
All right, Anthony, let me know when you're ready, and I will start your timer, and you have 15 minutes.
Okay, I'm ready.
All right, you got it.
All right, because Mark's gospel presents itself as the fulfillment of the new Exodus hope of the Old Testament, it's requisite to briefly rehearse that foundational event and have it before us. At the time of the Exodus, Pharaoh defiantly taunted, "Who is the Lord that I should listen to him?" This question received a definitive answer from the Lord, who demonstrated who he is by going forth as a man of war, Exodus 15:3, performing numerous signs and wonders in the sight of Israel and doing battle with Pharaoh, his wise men, and the gods of Egypt. All of this culminated in the Lord ransoming the people and delivering them from the land of the dead by rebuking the waters of the Red Sea, with the Lord himself crossing over before them and then drowning Pharaoh and his legion in the sea. The Lord then led the people into the wilderness, where he miraculously fed them manna, bread from heaven, and then brought them to the foot of Mount Sinai, where Moses was told by the Lord in Exodus 24:1, "Come up the mountain to the Lord." Contextually, the Lord was referring to the angel of his presence, that fully divine person about whom the Lord spoke in the immediate context, saying, "Be on your guard before him and listen to him, for he will not pardon your transgression, since my name is in him." As momentous as all of this was, the people often murmured and tempted the Lord in the wilderness, thereby displaying uncircumcised hearts and ears. By their actions, they asked the same question as Pharaoh: "Who is this that we should listen to him?" All of this pointed to the need for something greater and prefigured what the Lord was going to do in the future. For example, in places like Isaiah 40 through 66 or Malachi 3 and 4, the prophets spoke of the fact that the Lord himself was going to come again and accomplish a new and better Exodus. The glory of the Lord that had departed from Israel was going to return, and he was going to bring about eternal redemption from sin and death, the defeat of the evil one and his troops, and pour out his spirit to give his people circumcised hearts and ears. Significantly, Isaiah repeatedly referred to this new Exodus hope as good news or gospel. As we turn to Mark, this is exactly what we find. The incipit of the book, the very first line, identifies it as the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. It's my contention in this debate that this title in Mark indicates that Jesus is the true and proper Son of the Father, the Son by nature, and therefore the very coming of the Lord promised in the Old Testament. Mark himself makes this clear by what he immediately goes on to say in verses 2 and 3. Kathos gegraptai, just as it is written, a phrase in Mark that always points back to it's the explanation of what has just preceded. And in this case, it's a composite citation of Isaiah 40, verse 3, and Malachi 3, verse 1. "Behold, I send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make ready the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." This is what Mark means by the Son of God. As the Son, really and truly, Jesus Christ is the Lord. In fact, this quote from Isaiah 40 is a scene of God announcing in his heavenly court what is to come. And Mark gives these words a prosopological cast. He presents these as words of direct address by the Father to the Son prior to the sending of John. Behold, I send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. In other words, this address to the Son as the Lord took place in heaven prior to the sending of John. In light of these programmatic words at the start of the book, where Jesus, the Son of God, is identified by the Father as the promised Lord, it's not surprising that the title Son of God is used throughout Mark in a patently divine sense. For example, Christ's sonship is something exclusive to him, as indicated in 1:11, 9:7, and 12:6, where it's modified by the word agapetos, which standard lexicons define as the one and only of his class. Jesus is God's Son in a unique sense from all who came before him. Even David and his royal descendants, who served as mere types and shadows of the reality embodied only in Jesus. Christ's sonship, furthermore, entails the possession of transcendent authority over everyone and everything, as seen in his authority over the demons, who already know him, by the way, as the Son of God, and fear that he's come to destroy them. 124 and 5:7, and also from the fact that Jesus, by this title, distinguished and ranked himself above all the prophets in 12:6 and all men and angels in 13:32. Furthermore, as the Son, Jesus possesses unearthly heavenly glory that is essential to him, as seen in Mark 9, where he transfigured himself before the disciples. That this glory is heavenly is seen from the fact that his clothes became, quote, radiant, intensely white, as no launderer on earth could bleach them. That this glory was essential to him and not merely reflected glory as a result of being in the divine presence is seen from the fact that he was transfigured before the descent of the Father. It was in this context, and to underscore the significance of it, that the Father then descended and declared, "This is my beloved Son." Finally, it was precisely Jesus' claim to be the Son of God that the Sanhedrin in Mark 14 condemned as blasphemy, which can only mean that they thought he was making a divine claim, a claim that is either gloriously true or blasphemously false. Likewise, given the programmatic words of the prologue, which identify Jesus as the Son of God and as such the Lord, this is exactly how Jesus is presented in the narrative. For example, in 2:28, Jesus claimed to be the Lord of the Sabbath, a divine institution. In 11:3, Jesus, as the Lord, claimed absolute ownership over the property of others. In 12:37, Jesus claimed to be the very Lord of Psalm 110, and therefore greater than David or any mere son of David. And in 13:35, Jesus referred to his return to the world as the coming of Hakurios te oikos, the Lord of the house. As if these categorical claims to be the Lord were not enough, Jesus even reenacted the events of the first Exodus, thereby also anticipating his new Exodus redemptive work that he was about to accomplish on the cross. For example, in Mark 4, we're told that Jesus rebuked the wind and the sea, causing them to be still so that his disciples could safely cross over into the wilderness, the exact thing the Lord did at the Exodus. Psalm 106, he rebuked the Red Sea and led them through the deeps as through the wilderness. Or again, Psalm 89, you rule the swelling of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. Immediately after this, in Mark 5, Jesus proceeded to deliver the Gerasene demoniac from a legion of demons, causing them to be drowned in the sea, just like the Lord drowned Pharaoh and his legion in the sea. This is then followed in Mark 6 with Jesus miraculously feeding a multitude of Israelites in the wilderness. Mark 4, 5, and 6 then record Jesus doing signature acts of the Lord, things that the Lord alone can do and did do. Mark records Jesus doing them in the exact order in which the Lord did them, and he also uses the precise Old Testament language to describe these things. If you aren't catching what Mark is throwing at you, you might be a Unitarian. And for the sake of those who didn't catch it, Jesus did it all over again. At the end of Mark 6, Jesus once again delivered the disciples from the sea, even saying, "Take courage, I am, do not fear," which is followed in chapter 7 by Jesus delivering a girl from a demon, one of Satan's troops, and then in chapter 8 by Jesus once again feeding a multitude in the wilderness. Again, if you're not picking up what Mark is putting down, you might be a Unitarian. To cap it all off, after this recapitulation twice over of Exodus-like events, delivering them from the sea, overtoppling Satan's hosts, and feeding the people in the wilderness, they then went up the mountain in Mark 9, where the Father, in the presence of Moses, said regarding Jesus, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." The exact thing the Lord told Moses in Exodus 23 with respect to that theophanic person who bears his very name, the one the Father called the Lord, Jehovah, in Exodus 24:1. The words of the prologue, you see, especially verses 1 through 3, are programmatic for the rest of the gospel. Mark announced already at the beginning who Jesus is and what he came to do. He is the divine Son of God and Lord who came to effect a new Exodus. And so when we see things in the narrative, the sorts of things I just mentioned, and see people at every turn either objecting to what Jesus does since it involves the exercise of exclusive divine prerogatives or presupposes the possession of incommunicable divine attributes, forgiving sin, knowing the hearts of men, performing a divine work on the Sabbath, or we see people being amazed and dumbfounded that this man wields paramount authority over creation, over the demons, over all sin and disease, over life and death itself. The reader has already been told what the people in the narrative do not yet have eyes to see. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, together with his Father, is Lord, the one Lord of Israel. This is the thesis and plot of the book. Mark has already told the reader in the prologue who Jesus is, and the question on everyone's lips is, who is this? When Jesus forgave the sins of the paralytic man in Mark 2, the scribes objected. Why does this man speak that way? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins except one, God? Mark's answer in the prologue, this is the Lord. Or again, in Mark 11, the chief priests, scribes, and elders ask, by what authority are you doing these things? In other words, who do you think you are, and why should we listen to you? Mark's answer in the prologue, he is the Lord. It's because these scribes, these PhDs, only recognize that Jesus is a man. In other words, they were Socinians before their time, that they thought Jesus was blaspheming for saying and doing what could only be said and done by one, God. The rulers of that age did not understand, for if they had understood, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. The plot is also seen in the case of the masses who hear without hearing and see without seeing, and so are left utterly amazed and dumbfounded, wondering what this is all about. In Mark 1:27, for example, they were all amazed, and so they debated among themselves, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they listen to him." What is this? It's the coming of the Lord. The Lord of glory, the Lord of the Exodus, has returned to his people. In Mark 6:2, it's written that the many listeners were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things? And what is this wisdom that's been given to him? And such miracles as these performed by his hands?" Mark 7:37, they were utterly astonished, saying, "He's done all things well. He makes even those who are deaf hear and those who are unable to talk speak." Why is everyone amazed and dumbfounded? Because they think he's only a man. And everywhere they are described by Mark as deaf, dumb, and blind. The plot is even seen in the case of the disciples who only arrive at a partial understanding prior to the cross and resurrection. In Mark 4, after Jesus rebuked the wind and the sea, the fearful response of the disciples was, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea listen to him?" Mark's answer in the prologue, this is the Lord. After feeding the multitude and walking on the water in Mark 6 and declaring himself to be the I am, it says the disciples were utterly astonished, for they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. The same thing is seen again in Mark 8:17 through 18 and all the way up to the cross. The divine identity of Christ, you see, is the thesis of Mark's gospel. And the failure and need to recognize it is the plot. Over and over again, we're told that the people recognized Jesus as a man, and in some cases, even as a prophet and the Christ, but not as the divine Son of God and Lord, because their eyes were closed, their ears were stopped up, they had stiff necks and hard hearts, something that could only be overcome by Jesus going before his people, becoming their Passover lamb, and passing through the waters of death, thereafter to ascend that heavenly Mount Zion and pour out his Spirit. And you, the listener, if you have ears to hear, do not miss this fact. This is also the plot of this debate. One person in this debate stands on the side of the narrator and is telling you that Jesus is the Lord, who of old delivered the people from the land of the dead and now has come in the fullness of time to deliver his people from death itself. The other person in this debate, like the scribes, the wise men, the philosophers and disputers of this age, believes that Jesus is only a man, or at best, nothing more than a son of David. He stumbles, as you're going to hear, over the fact that Jesus prayed, was tempted, ate, slept, served, and died. And his hope in this debate is that he, by taunting you with these facts and tacitly joining in with the mockery of those who rejected Christ, can thereby crucify and silence Christ's divine claims. But don't you see, while Jesus was certainly a man, Mark's gospel demonstrates that he was a man of war, the Lord Jehovah, Exodus 15:3, Isaiah 42:13, who came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And I'll conclude with that.
All right. Thank you, Anthony. Appreciate that opening statement. All right, Dr. Del Tuggy, you're up for your 15-minute opening. Let me reset your time, and then you can go for it. All right, time is reset. Let me know when you're ready.
Okay, thanks.
All right, you got it.
Does the gospel according to Mark teach that Jesus is the one true God? Of course it doesn't. The suggestion is ridiculous. And today I will explain why any careful reader of this gospel can reasonably dismiss any scholarship that focuses on some details in the book and tries to show that the author has sneakily encoded a Jesus is God message into it. And keep in mind that our debate topic today is not, is Jesus more than a mere man? Or is he in some sense divine? Or does the author hint that Jesus pre-existed? No, the question is whether or not this book teaches Jesus to be the one true God himself. Clearly, the answer to that question is no. We can see this by looking at what the book does say, what it doesn't say, and what sort of book this is. Let's start with what the book clearly asserts. Its clear main thesis, contra Mr. Rogers, is that Jesus is God's Messiah, his Christ, also called the Son of God and the Son of Man. This thesis is stated by the narrator, by friendly characters in the narrative, by lots of hostile characters, and by the main character himself, our Lord Jesus, and even by the voice of God himself, who is somebody else, by the way. A high point in the book is the scene where the disciples finally get it, grasping Jesus' true identity. Here Jesus asks the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answer him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, still others, one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." And Jesus sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Notice Jesus' implicit agreement with Peter's answer. Similarly, in chapter 14, when the high priest asks him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" which is to say, the Son of God, Jesus answers that he is. In the narrative, Jesus keeps his status as Messiah quiet, revealing it only to a select few. But this book shouts from the rooftops that which was once hidden. Throughout the book, our author proclaims his message over and over again. The point can't be missed. Even someone who sleeps through the middle chapters but wakes up near the end will hear a Roman soldier declare upon witnessing Jesus' death that truly this man was God's son. And posted on his cross is a true title of God's Messiah, the King of the Jews. From our author's standpoint, Jesus' enemies meant this as a criminal charge, but God meant it as yet another divinely ordained hostile testimony. Is this crucified Jesus the God of Israel, the one true God? Of course he's not. Numerous factors communicate this. First, a Messiah is literally an anointed one called, commissioned, and empowered by God for an all-important mission. The anointee is not the anointer. Nor is this unique Son of God the same God whose Son he is. The metaphor wouldn't make sense. Second, the reader needs to approach the book with some common sense. What is the chance that the author would expend all his energy telling us that Jesus is God's Messiah, when in fact he holds to the much stronger and stranger claim that Jesus is God himself? It's incredibly unlikely. If you read a book about George Washington and the author labors over and over to communicate that Washington was an honest man, it is vanishingly unlikely that the author also thinks that the really important thing to know about George Washington is that he was a space alien who had morphed into human form so as to live among us. Third, throughout this book, Jesus is portrayed as a real man. He has a human mother. He's a descendant of King David. And it's a background assumption of Judaism that God is not a man and is not, of course, a descendant of anyone, human or otherwise. Fourth, Jesus' favorite title for himself here is the Son of Man, which literally means a human being, but is also a clear reference to the one like a Son of Man in the vision of Daniel chapter 7. But this one is not the one God. Rather, in Daniel's vision, this one is brought into God's presence, and God gives him dominion and glory and kingship that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. This we see fulfilled in Jesus in the Revelation, in the vision of Revelation chapter 5. There too, just like in Daniel 7, he's a character in addition to the one God. And the one we see on the throne is the one God. He's introduced in Revelation chapter 4. Fifth, God is not a prophet. And this Jesus in the gospel according to Mark, even though he's greater than the greatest previous prophet, Moses, still as God's Messiah, he's also a prophet. That is, a human who speaks God's words to the people. Sixth, the book assumes and implies many differences that distinguish Jesus from his God. Unlike the one true God, Jesus prays to God. Along with his disciples, Jesus sings a hymn to God. Unlike the untemptable God, Jesus is tempted. Unlike the invulnerable and essentially well-off God, Jesus is afraid before his crucifixion and feels abandoned by God when it happens. Unlike the essentially immortal God, Jesus dies. Unlike the essentially omniscient God, there are truths Jesus does not know. Unlike the essentially omnipotent God, sometimes Jesus lacks enough power to do something. While God doesn't need permission or authorization or empowerment from anyone to do anything, Jesus is authorized and empowered by someone else, God, to heal, to exercise, and even to forgive sins. And while God can say, I created the world, Jesus describes someone else as the creator, God, that is, the one he calls Father. And when someone addresses Jesus with the title Good Teacher, Jesus snaps back, why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. Clearly, Jesus can be called good. The reader infers that Jesus must have in mind some sort of goodness which he lacks, but God has. Perhaps underived goodness or absolutely perfect goodness, such as would entail absolute immunity to temptation. When this book distinguishes Jesus from his Father, it thereby distinguishes Jesus from God, for the assumption here is that the one God and the Father are one and the same. The one just is the other. The 4th century idea of multiple persons in the one God is nowhere to be found in this mid-1st century book. The famous Shema passage from Deuteronomy 6 is discussed in Mark 12, but Jesus simply agrees with his Jewish interlocutor about it, declining the opportunity to revise Jewish monotheism so as to include himself, as people say nowadays, in the divine identity. Passing by such deep thoughts, Jesus here simply lets stand the Jewish scribe's statement about God that he is one and besides him there is no other. Notice that God here is a he and a him, a single self, and someone other than Jesus. Nor is there any suggestion or hint that Jesus has a divine and a human nature, so that, for example, he might be all-knowing in his divine nature and limited in knowledge in his human nature. Mark simply doesn't need any such hypothesis. Also missing is any passage that could possibly suggest that Jesus is eternal, that he created the cosmos, or that God created it through him. Nowhere is Jesus described or addressed as God. This Jesus is never portrayed as having some attribute only God can have, such as essential omniscience, omnipotence, eternality, uncreatedness, or aseity. If you think any of those attributes can be found in other New Testament books, and that such passages in those books are evidence that those authors think that Jesus is God, then you need to recognize that their complete absence in this book is also strong evidence that the author does not think that Jesus is God. Because if he thought that, surely he would have clearly indicated it in some such ways. This author never bothers to warn the reader against thinking that Jesus is a mere man, that is, a man who doesn't have a divine nature too. No, not even the Transfiguration in chapter 9. Simply, glowing bright white doesn't imply being God. This is a kind of glory temporarily given to the man Jesus by his and our God, the one who in this very incident tells the disciples with Jesus, "This is my son, the beloved, listen to him." Neither the narrator nor the characters conclude from this incident that Jesus has a divine nature, and neither should you. Nor do his works show him to be God. The Jesus of the New Testament Gospels does things some assume only God can do. Thus, in Mark chapter 1, the people are amazed that Jesus has authority over unclean spirits. One might suppose this is because Jesus is God himself. But in chapter 6, we see that Jesus has passed on this authority to his disciples, who proceed to cast out demons too. It's clear that neither the disciples nor Jesus cast out demons by their own divine power, but rather by authority and power given from God, Jesus directly and his disciples through him. The general lesson here is that when you see Jesus' followers doing something, even what is normally, quote, a divine prerogative, this means that doing that does not require being the one God or having a divine nature. If it did, we'd have way too many gods. Against this heavy mass of clear facts and plausible assumptions, some learned readers who are sold out to Catholic traditions will try to move heaven and earth to find an implication in this book that Jesus is the one true God. I'll discuss why later. But as you heard at the start of this debate, they grasp at straws and flail ineffectively around the topic, often retreating back to much lesser claims, such that Jesus and God here are closely associated, that both are called Lord in this book, or that Jesus is the Son of God in a unique sense. All true claims, but not to the point. At other times, they argue using unsupportable premises, such as that only God himself can control the wind and the waves, or that God himself can forgive sins, or that only God himself can walk on water. The problem is that it would seem to be an easy thing for the omnipotent God to empower a human being to do such things. In many cases, the speculations are so unhinged that they reveal a misunderstanding of the genre and intended audience of this book. Mark wrote an action-packed, simple narrative, which, as we've seen, is wholly oriented around presenting Jesus as truly God's Messiah, the King of the Jews, the Son of God, the Son of David, and the Son of Man. The author hammers home this point clearly and repeatedly and in several ways so that it can't be missed, even by a half-asleep listener. Notice I just said listener, not reader. In ancient times, literacy was fairly rare. We should assume that Mark knew who his audience was. It was believers in house churches and small gatherings that would include men and women, young and old, slave and free. Most of the audience then would be listeners, not readers, and the average education level would be very low. As Paul wrote to the Christians at Corinth, not many of you were wise by human standards. A competent teacher facing this crowd does not cleverly encode his main or most important message underneath a surface message. A competent writer addressing this crowd doesn't expect people to read between the lines. Rather, he writes punchy, action-packed lines, puts all of his message there writ large, and this is exactly what our author has done. Right? This book was not designed to be a playground for scholars to come up with new ways to try to derive the deity of Christ from it, new ways which were never heard of in ancient times or in medieval times in many cases. It's not for the hint hunting scholar. It's for the eighth grader. It's for the working mom. It's for the average Joe Sixpack. That's the genre. In conclusion, everyone, whatever their theological persuasion, should agree that this gospel does not present Jesus as the one God. Yes, even a Trinitarian. Yes, even someone who believes in the deity of Christ. Not every biblical book has to teach all the important truths. It is jarring and odd, to be sure, if Mark should leave out such an alleged central truth that Christ is God. But this is simply the book we have, people. A Trinitarian should just say, I guess for some reason this gospel spotlights Jesus's humanity without teaching his divinity. Indeed, most Trinitarian scholars, one who are actually experts on this book, don't go nearly as far as my debate opponent today. Generally speaking, commenters will limit themselves to suggesting that the title Son of God may mean more than Messiah, perhaps, suggesting that Jesus as God's Son is in some sense divine and not a mere man. A Trinitarian is well advised to side with these scholars and leave aside overreaching, anachronism-crazy, flailing apologetics. Mark is no murmuring occultist. He has actually succeeded in clearly getting across his message that Jesus is God's Christ. Thank you.
All right. All right, guys, thank you for those opening statements. So now we transition to our rebuttal round. And let me pull this up. Yeah, our transition to a rebuttal round. The rebuttal will be 10 minutes, and then we'll follow that with a 5-minute rebuttal. So start with Anthony Rogers. You're up for your 10-minute rebuttal.
All right. Lamentably, Dale spent much of his time laboring to demonstrate points that aren't at issue in this debate. As an Orthodox Christian, I adamantly affirm Christ's true humanity. Indeed, my very salvation depends upon it. That's why I began this debate by thanking Christ, my Lord, for giving himself for me. And so talking about Jesus being a descendant of David, talking about Jesus saying and doing other things that bespeak the fact that he is a real man is irrelevant, utterly irrelevant to our debate. Having said that he's a man, in Dale's mind, though, means that Jesus can't be God, just like distinguishing him from the Father in Dale's mind means that he can't be God. But notice that both of these things assume already what I reject and, in fact, refuted in my opening statement. Jesus is a man, but he's an incarnate person. He is the Lord. And since I'm not a Unitarian, it's irrelevant to show that Jesus is distinguished from God. Dale said this is reading 4th century theology back into the New Testament, but of course it's not. Anybody who's read the ancient fathers prior to Nicaea knows that I'm not coming up with things ad hoc here. Irenaeus, for example, in his book Against Heresies, volume 5, said, how can sins be rightly remitted unless the one against whom one has sinned grants the pardon? He's arguing that Jesus is God on the basis of what we read in Mark 2. Novatian, in his book on the Trinity, chapter 13, says, if Christ forgives sins, Christ must be truly God, because no one can forgive sins but God alone. So this isn't an anachronistic reading of later theology back into the Bible. In fact, Dale holds a theology from the 17th century known as Socinianism. That, I suggest to you, is what's being read back into Mark's gospel. In fact, Dale assumes Unitarianism, but Dale knows that Second Temple Jews were not Unitarians. Second Temple Jews did not, in fact, believe that God could be reduced to a single person, to a blank monad. Now, another thing that Dale does that's reductionistic and just utterly glosses over what's found in Mark's gospel, what I presented in my opening statement, is he tries to reduce the title Son of God, which is a patently divine title. He tries to make it a mere synonym of the title Christ. But it's clear in Mark's gospel that Son of God and Christ are not synonymous titles. For example, in Mark 1:1, when it says the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God there is not being used in apposition with the title Christ, because the word Christ isn't even being used there as a title, but as part of a compound name. So it's not being used in a titular fashion, and therefore Son of God is not being used as a definition of Christ. It is an additional title for Jesus, indicating who Jesus is. When Dale says that Mark 8 is the high point of the book, he's again, stumbling over this confusion. It's not the high point of the book. In fact, what Dale calls the high point of the book, astoundingly, is where Peter makes a major faceplant. After Peter accurately confesses Jesus as the Christ, he shows that his insight is not yet complete, because Peter is immediately thereafter rebuked by Jesus as Satan. So what Dale thinks is Peter arriving at a full and complete picture of Jesus is something that Jesus himself denounced as satanic. Rather, the high point, both literally and literarily, is Mark 9, when Jesus then takes them up the mountain and the Father declares in their hearing, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." As I pointed out in my opening presentation, the whole picture here is that of Jesus as a divine person. He is transfigured before the disciples, before the cloud descends on the mountain. So this isn't merely reflected glory. It says that his clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no launderer on earth could bleach them, indicating that it's heavenly glory. This is all prior to the cross and resurrection. So Jesus has essential heavenly glory. And it's in this context that the Father ups the ante and tells the disciples, no, not merely the Christ, but the Son of God, the one to whom all men are to listen. It even uses the exact language used for the Melech Yahweh in Exodus 23, the one whom the Father calls Jehovah in Exodus 24:1, telling Moses, listen to him. So Jesus is not being identified as Son of God in this reductionistic sense. He is exclusively the Son. All who came before Jesus were but types and shadows of the reality embodied in him. This is why Mark identifies Jesus as the Lord. And he doesn't leave this title out there as something ambiguous. He explicitly ties it to Old Testament texts about Jehovah. Isaiah 40, verse 30, or verse 3, is said to be fulfilled in Jesus. He is the coming of the Lord. He also quotes Malachi 3, verse 1, where the coming one is called Ha-Adon, an exclusively divine title. Repeatedly throughout the book, Jesus even says and does that which God alone does. Dale says that Jesus is not doing things that only God can do. But of course he is. The Old Testament not only says this is what God did, it not only uses the language that's used for God, but where the statements are even exclusive to God. For example, in Job 9, it says that the Lord, Jehovah, is the one stretching out heaven alone and walking upon the sea as upon a floor. That's what Jesus did in Mark 6, and it says Jehovah alone does that. Now, Dale says Jesus could do this because he was given authority. But nowhere in Mark's gospel does it speak of Jesus being given authority. Everywhere it simply speaks of Jesus having authority. The only time it speaks of anyone being given authority, it's Jesus who gives it. Jesus gave the disciples authority in Mark 3. He gave the disciples authority in Mark 6. And even that was limited in the case of the disciples, but not so in the case of Jesus. For example, in Mark 9, the disciples couldn't cast out a demon, even though they were given authority, and Jesus says, you can only do this by prayer. But Jesus proceeded to cast out the demon without prayer. He simply speaks and it happens. This is why people marveled over Jesus, because he exercised unprecedented authority, the authority of the Lord himself, the authority that the Lord alone had and wielded. And he, again, he does the exact things God does. He does them in the exact same order. The exact same language is used for him. And again, these are signature acts of Yahweh, things that Yahweh alone does. Dale mentioned that this is not, Mark's not sneakily coding in things here. I agree. There's certainly many things that Mark does that tie in with the Old Testament that the alert reader would pick up that maybe somebody ill-informed about the Old Testament wouldn't. but he also states things quite explicitly. He explicitly calls Jesus the coming Lord in 1:3. He explicitly calls Jesus the Lord in 5:19. He explicitly calls Jesus the Lord in 11:3. He explicitly calls Jesus the Lord of the Sabbath in 2:28. Over and over again, Mark states explicitly what he also states in a narratival way in more implicit fashion. Dale said, if somebody wrote a novel about George Washington and said he was an excellent man, you wouldn't get the impression from that he was an alien. Well, what if the person in that novel not only told you that he was an excellent man, but also told you that George Washington had antennas that came up out of his head, that sometimes he looked green in a certain light, that some people heard, or saw sights above his house that looked like, rotating bright orbs or what have you. The alert listener would start to think there's something else bizarre going on about this man. And Mark not only does this sort of thing with respect to Jesus, such as when he shows him reenacting the events of the Exodus, but even states these things explicitly. Jesus is the divine Son of God. That's why the high priest said it was blasphemy. It was not blasphemy to claim to be the Christ. It was blasphemy to claim to be the divine Son of God, that fully divine person who together with the Father exercises universal dominion over all creation. Indeed, in the same text, Jesus said that he would come riding the clouds of heaven, something used exclusively for God in the Old Testament. Throughout the Old Testament, it's God who rides the clouds. Psalm 104:3, he lays the beams of his upper chambers in the waters. He makes the clouds his chariots. He walks upon the wings of the wind. Jesus is the one who knows the hearts of men, Mark 2, Mark 3, verse 5. The Old Testament, 1 Kings 8, other passages say God alone knows the hearts of men. So yes, Jesus does things, and it's not sufficient for Dale to say, well, God could give him this authority, because these are things exclusively reserved for God. These are signature acts of God. These are things that God says and does to show who he is. Throughout the Exodus, one of the constant refrains is that God is doing these things so that people would know that he is the Lord. If somebody else could do these things, then these signature acts would be worthless. The very point is, these things betoken the person who does them. They indicate that he himself is the Lord. This is what Jesus says and does throughout Mark's gospel. And that's why, Dale, you see, when you look at the people in the narrative who are objecting to Jesus, they object to Jesus in the exact way that Dale does. Isn't this the carpenter? If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross.
All right, that's
God
time,
can't
Anthony.
die.
That's time right there.
Okay.
All right. Dale, you're up for your 10-minute rebuttal.
Yeah, that's kind of hilarious to try to associate me with Jesus's enemies and the Jews. It sounds like the people who agree the most with Mr. Rogers are Jesus's enemies in chapter 2 and the high priest in chapter 14, the people who precisely are not getting it. Notice over and over again, first of all, there are modern misreadings on display here. He in his opening said that the thesis of Mark's gospel is the divine identity of Jesus. Guys, this is just a confused and confusing neologism that has become popular in about the last 20 years. It was invented by a British scholar named Richard Bauckham. Not only is it not part of this book, it's not even part of, mainstream Christian tradition before 25, 30 years ago. And it's absurd that the main thesis is the divine identity of Jesus. It just isn't. And better scholars don't go so far as to say that clearly Son of God implies having the divine essence, the divine nature. That, in fact, is an argument that is due precisely to Athanasius in the 4th century. That's the guy that invents that argument, that to be a real son, Jesus has to be homoousion with the Father. He has to have the same substance or essence. Even people before, like Origen, Justin, and so on, even Novatian and Irenaeus, they don't think he's divine in the same sense that the one God is divine, even though they do speculate about his two natures. Also, notice what Mr. Rogers done. He very much focuses on what he thinks are his ace 2 passages, which are chapter 1, which he totally misunderstands, and chapter 9, the Transfiguration. Take the Transfiguration first. He claims that this is just a revelation of Jesus's divine essence. Oh, to the contrary. It says, and he was transfigured before them. And commenters like Robert Gundry point out that this is a divine passive. And so it implies not that Jesus, Gundry says, has a glory hidden at other times by his clothes and flesh. On the contrary, the divine passive in verse 2 and the emphasis on the glistening of his garments point to a glory bestowed from without. Many other commenters very plausibly argue that this is a preview of Jesus's heavenly glory once he is raised and exalted to God's right hand, like you see in Revelation 5. And that indeed is a very plausible reading. Now go back to chapter 1. Again, a fashionable misunderstanding here. I call it the fulfillment fallacy. And the fallacy goes like this. There are statements made about Yahweh in the Old Testament. New Testament author comes along and says that they are fulfilled in Jesus. And the reader says, aha, see, that shows that the author is telling us that God just is Jesus. Now, this is not only is this not correct, it's a kind of a beginner's mistake in interpreting the New Testament, right? Consider Matthew 1. The author says that Jesus' birth is a fulfillment of a prophecy in Isaiah 7 about a baby named Emmanuel. Well, Emmanuel was a baby in the time of Isaiah. Now, when he says that Jesus fulfilled that, he's not telling you that Jesus is that baby from the time of Isaiah. That would be a weird case of reincarnation. What are they doing with these texts? They're doing, I think, one of two things. They're either viewing Jesus as the one through whom God is acting, and so God does fulfill it himself, but through Jesus. Or sometimes they just seem to think that there is a different meaning encoded by God, a meaning that wasn't known to the human author or to earlier readers. And there are just two fulfillments, because there's the kind of the meaning that the human author knew, and there's another meaning in play too that in these latter days has finally become known. As many commenters point out, when Mark mashes up those three quotations, he changes the wording a little bit so that you don't think that this is God himself, this Jesus who's being announced by John the Baptist. So he changes the me in Malachi 3:1 to your in verse 2. In Isaiah 44, he changes the highway of our God to making his paths straight, that is the Lord, understood as the Lord Jesus. So yeah, chapter 1 doesn't tell you that Jesus is the one God. In fact, Jesus is distinguished from the one God. Jesus is the one that gets baptized. The one God is the one that says, hey, this is my beloved son. In that scene. Let's see, I'm not going to waste time with all the assuming Unitarianism standard stuff. Prosopological address in heaven before Jesus's birth. He wants to read these words from the prophets as, reflecting a conversation before Jesus's incarnation, I guess. Well, there's just no reason to take it that way. All it needs to be is a prediction, a meaning that was hidden at the time, a prediction that's filled in the time of Jesus's and John's ministry. So I agree that there is a new Exodus theme, but look, these arguments that he does things that only God can do are completely absurd. To claim that only God can walk on the water would make Peter God. Peter steps out in faith in the Matthew version of walking on the water, and he's not God. And Mr. Rogers is just assuming throughout, he's got this theory that Jesus has a divine nature, and he's like, well, look, this is the only explanation of what you see here. Okay, but the theory doesn't really have any foundation in what the author explicitly says. And also notice that the narrator and the characters don't infer anything about Jesus being God from all these wonderful things. What they do infer is that Jesus' authority is, it says in one place, from heaven. That is, he gets his authority, his mission, his power from God. That's the understanding. The misunderstanding, thinking that Jesus is God himself, I think it goes way back. There have probably always been at least a few people who think that only God can forgive sins, and then ridiculously agree with Jesus's critics in chapter 2. Okay, but notice a few things about that incident. The author himself gives no signals that this is supposed to show that Jesus is God. On the face of it, his critics' assumption that only God can forgive is as false as their belief that Jesus has blasphemed. He hasn't blasphemed, nor is it true that God only can forgive. Jesus says the point, actually, that not that he heals in order to show that he's God, but he says, quote, that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive. And the reader understands, authority given by God. And right, the crowd actually gets the point that God has authorized Jesus to forgive, which is why, verse 12, they glorify God, not Jesus, for what just happened. They know that it's God working through him. And interestingly, when John presents this, he gives a little extra crowd reaction element to the story, which seems designed specifically to head off this misunderstanding of agreeing with Jesus's critics. So Matthew writes in Matthew 9:8, when the crowd saw it, they were filled with awe, and they glorified God who had given such authority to human beings. Right, humans like Jesus, the human Messiah. And he's just making explicit what is implicit. So to forgive is a divine prerogative, but it can be shared. As shown by when Jesus authorizes his apostles to forgive in John 20. Right, so we know this is an early Christian belief, that you don't have to be God himself or fully divine to forgive. Our Second Temple Jews, assuming that God is multi-personal, this is a kind of a out there fringe view, I think, that Mr. Rogers has, that Jews in this era were Trinitarian, or at least they think God is multi-personal. I think that's obviously incorrect. And you can see it reflected in this book in chapter 12 and in various bits of other places here and elsewhere in the New Testament, where Jews are referring to God as a single self using singular personal pronouns. There isn't anything in the book which could reasonably be taken as absurdly implying that Jesus, quote, is the same God as his Father, or that they is the same Lord. That's just confusion. Now, about the term Lord, we need to go to the lexicon to help us. There is no meaning of Lord in the New Testament when it refers to or covers God and Jesus, or the Father and the Son. It's used in four ways. It can mean sir. It's a polite term of address. It can mean Lord in the sense of a boss, like Lord of a manor. It can be a substitute for the divine name. In Old Testament quotations, instead of saying Yahweh or trying to transliterate it, they just substitute Kurios, the Lord. And the fourth meaning is a New Testament meaning. It's for the Lord Jesus, the one whom God, as it says in Acts 2, has made both Lord and Christ. It's the unique Lord under the unique God of the New Testament.
All right. Thank you. All right, Anthony, you're up for your 5-minute rebuttal.
All right, disquisitively, Dale began this debate by pretending that if we want to see the deity of Christ here, my position, in Mark, then we have to view Mark as somehow sneakily coding things into his gospel. And yet Dale, in order to defend his position in this debate, has told us that when Mark quotes the Old Testament text about the Lord and says that it's fulfilled in Jesus, that this has some meaning encoded by God that Mark recognizes. In other words, Dale's the one who thinks that there's this esoteric meaning to be read into this. That's not my view. That's his view. So he should apply those epithets to himself. Moreover, he can't decide whether the enemies of Jesus are being used by Mark as a foil for the truth, even though they don't intend these things in the way they're saying them. Because at one point he said, the people were ridiculing Jesus at the cross, saying he's the king of the Jews, when they don't believe that, but that's really true according to Mark. Well, by the same token, he should agree that when the Pharisees in Mark 2 are saying that only God can forgive sins, Mark is using them as a foil to present what is actually true. This is a signature act of God. Only God can forgive sins that are committed against himself. That's not just something that I'm making up. That's something that the Bible itself teaches. For example, in the book of Isaiah, the Lord says, I am the one who blots out your sins and transgressions for my sake. He is the one who forgives sins. The Pharisees were right about that, but they were wrong to say that Jesus didn't have the authority to do it. Now, Dale did try to deal a little bit with the reference in Mark 1 which I'm happy you finally got to. That's Mark's thesis, after all. And he says that I was engaging here in the fulfillment fallacy. But then he didn't go on to tell us what's fallacious about it. He simply said it's a fulfillment fallacy. Another attempt to try and deal with this was to say that this involves double fulfillment. That is, for example, in Matthew 1, he says Jesus is the fulfillment of the Emmanuel prophecy, but Emmanuel was a child at the time of Isaiah. Prove it. That's not true. I don't grant the whole notion of double fulfillment. That's something made up by people who don't know how prophecies are relevant in the past to their original audience and somehow fulfilled in the future. So Dale's going to have to put up the evidence or simply clam up at this point. And notice again that Dale says that I'm just reading things into the text. I'm finding things encoded there, and he's just reading the surface level meaning of the text. Well, what happened when he looks at Mark 1:3? Mark 1:3, quoting the Old Testament about the coming of the Lord, says it's fulfilled in Jesus. Mark says, prepare the way of the Lord. Dale says this means that he was preparing the way for the one through whom the Lord was going to act. That's not what the text says. That's something read into the text. This is eisegesis, folks. It's not exegesis. Mark makes it explicit. The coming one is the Lord. Dale said in Mark 9, the transfiguration is not proof that Jesus has inherent heavenly glory, because rather it uses the divine passive. It says that he was transfigured before them. Dale is here assuming he keeps talking about what's modern, what's not modern. The whole notion of a divine passive is only about 75 years old, and it's been thoroughly debunked. In fact, throughout Mark's gospel, passive verbs are used to refer to things that Jesus did, not the Father. For example, in Mark 1:41, Jesus said to the leper, be cleansed. It's a passive verb, but it was Jesus who cleansed the leper. In fact, the leper said to Jesus, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus said, I am willing, be cleansed. So it uses a passive verb for something Jesus did. So when it says Jesus was transfigured, the fact that it's passive is irrelevant. It refers to an action performed by Jesus before the Father descended on the mountain. He said in an effort to support his Unitarian assumption, which he said he wasn't going to defend, he's just going to pass over it, but he nevertheless did appeal to Mark 12, saying in Mark 12, the Jews were simply Unitarians. They quoted the Shema. But he assumes that these Jews are understanding that in a 17th century Unitarian way. And even if that were the case, it should be obvious that Jesus puts them on the horns of a dilemma by immediately thereafter citing Psalm 110, where it says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Jesus said to them, how can he be David's son if David called him Lord? Notice this is the very conundrum that Dale faces in this debate. Dale said that Jesus can't be the Lord because he's a descendant of David. Jesus turns the tables and says, how can he be a son of David when David called him Lord? Dale says that when the high priest condemned Jesus for blasphemy, they're wrong, that this isn't blasphemy. Well, I agree that Jesus is not blaspheming, and that's only because Jesus is right. Dale's agreeing with them that Jesus is not the divine Son of God. I'm agreeing with them that if he were not the divine Son of God, it would be blasphemy. And obviously, Mark is saying that Jesus was claiming this, and they were wrong to reject his claim. He appeals to other gospels. In
All right, Anthony, that's time right there. That's time right there.
Okay.
All right. Dale, you're up for your 5-minute rebuttal.
Yeah, so again, notice he's driving a stake down in Mark 1 and Mark 9, misreading them and trying to make those the key to the whole book. My view is based on looking at the entire book and looking at what's the clear message. Other scholars who believe in the deity of Christ and who believe that Mark teaches the deity of Christ, they just flat embrace that there is a hidden message in addition to the surface message. Mr. Rogers can't even see clearly as to what the surface message is. So absurdly, he's saying that the surface message is that Jesus is the one God himself. I'm not saying, by the way, that every passive means that it's God who's the actor. Nobody thinks that. I don't see how you would establish, and he hasn't given us any argument other than saying that Jesus becomes bright before God speaks. I don't know how you would establish that that brightness is essential to Jesus. How would you rule out that there's a divine glorification happening before God speaks? I don't know. That's why that's not much of an argument. Now, he doesn't understand the fulfillment fallacy. Bizarrely, this is another fringe view. He doesn't think that that Jews in this time thought there could be multiple meanings of the Old Testament and multiple fulfillments. This is just a standard view. And what I called the fulfillment fallacy, I invented the term, but it's a standard view that this is a misunderstanding. The general theme of this, and he should know this, is the New Testament use of the Old Testament. Here's another example of the fulfillment fallacy in case you don't understand it. Psalm 110:1, the original context, all scholars agree, is that this was a royal psalm. So when Yahweh says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool, the words my Lord originally referred to David or some king of Israel, right? And when New Testament authors quote it, my Lord refers to Jesus. Now, is that their way of saying that Jesus is this former king of Israel? No, it's ridiculous. It's that there was a meaning that applied at the coronation of a king or some such context. And then there's another meaning, which was known only to God, which is fulfilled by the exaltation of Jesus. About Psalm 110:1 and that thing about David's Lord, I mean, this is kind of the most unclear passage in the book, because in the argument, Jesus just lets this question stand and they don't know how to answer it. So the question is, are the original readers, what are they supposed to draw? What's the conclusion that Mark thinks is so obvious that the original listeners would know about it and draw it, so that Mark doesn't have to bother to say how it is that Jesus can be called Lord, even though he's the son of David, or rather the Messiah, who is Jesus? The answer, I think, is what you see in Acts chapter 2, that God has made Jesus both Lord and Christ. Jesus has been made David's Lord by being exalted to God's right hand. And he is a son of David, meaning a descendant of David. Nevertheless, he's greater than his mighty, famous, important prophet, king, ancestor. He's greater than all other humans because he's been given the name above all names, as Paul says in Philippians chapter 2. So commenters point out that the point here is not that Jesus is God, but it's a series of three passages in which he's criticizing the views of the scribes. And basically, he's saying that this category, son of David, is inadequate by itself. It's inadequate to describe the Messiah, especially in light of the Messiah's, kind of godlike elevation to God's right hand. Blasphemy, yeah. I don't think you should draw too many conclusions based on accusations of blasphemy in this book. It's kind of unclear what these guys think blasphemy is. And I think Mark's point is that actually these turkeys are the ones blaspheming. I believe when he's getting taunted on the cross, the translations don't translate it as blaspheming, but it's the same Greek word, that they're blaspheming by mocking Jesus on the cross, right? Insulting God. Not because Jesus is God, but because God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. To, say this is a phony or a guy inspired by demons or something really is an insult to God. And that's kind of the core meaning of blasphemy. It's like insulting God. But I think I'll leave it there for now.
All right, guys. Thank you for those rebuttals. So now we're going to transition to our cross-examination portion of this debate. And once again, this is a total of 50 minutes. The first 30 minutes would be 15 minutes each to ask questions. And then the final 20 minutes would be more of an open discussion. Starting with Anthony, you're up for your 15-minute cross-examination of Dr. Del Tuggy.
All right, Dale, let's talk first about your invention of the fulfillment fallacy. Now, you've sort of switched terms here. When you talked about a fulfillment fallacy, you never actually gave examples for that. You switched to what you call double fulfillment. Those aren't the same thing, not even in your own terminology. Yes, you did. Well, let me ask my question. So you have said that Psalm 110 is originally a royal psalm that could have referred to David. Is that what Jesus says in Mark 12?
Well, let's look at Mark 12. I don't know. I don't have it right in front of
Well,
me.
I can tell you what it says.
He's assuming that
said,
it's
David
describing
himself,
the Messiah.
David himself, 12:37, calls him Lord. How then is he his
Right.
son? Is Jesus saying that this first had reference to David and then is fulfilled in him as a kind of double fulfillment, or it simply refers to him and that's who David was talking about?
Sorry, what's the question?
Okay. Your argument, your position is that there are double fulfillments going on, and that's how you try to neutralize the explicit statement in Mark 1:3. You said that Psalm 110 was originally fulfilled in David, but has a double fulfillment. It's fulfilled in Jesus. Jesus rules that out in Mark 12.
No, he doesn't rule it out.
Okay, 12:37.
David's the human author
Lord.
of this prophecy, which is being fulfilled.
That's
what he's presupposing.
So was David referring to himself in Psalm 110?
Well, he doesn't say
no.
what the original context was as distinct, but just look at what scholars say, Mr. Rogers, about this psalm.
Well, I don't care what scholars say. If Jesus in Mark 12
I know.
says David, yeah, you know, because it says David was talking about Jesus. David was not talking about himself. Okay, so what is your proof that Mark 1:3 is not talking about Jesus being the Lord, but rather the one through whom the Lord was acting? Mark explicitly says he's the Lord. You said he's the one through whom the Lord was acting. So what's your evidence for that?
Yeah, my evidence is that the entire book distinguishes between God and Jesus. They're two different characters,
and
they're never said or assumed to be the same Lord or the same God. That's my evidence.
You can't just keep saying the whole book says this if you can't even deal with one of the texts. In fact, one that comes at the very beginning of the book. The very beginning of the book calls him the Lord. So what proof do you have not to think of Jesus as the Lord, but as one through whom the Lord is acting?
I have the context of mid-first century documents, sir, in which Jesus
We're debating the Gospel of
commonly
Mark.
referred to as the one Lord in distinction from the one God. Ephesians 4, 1 Corinthians 8, etc.
You said you're appealing to the whole book then, ignoring the verse 3 of chapter 1. How about 2:28? That's part of the book too.
Context is king, man.
Okay, well here, listen to the king. In 2:28, the king says, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath, a divine institution. In 11:3, he claims to be the Lord who has ownership over the property of others. In 12, which we were just talking about, he claims to be David's Lord. Over and over again, he's called the Lord. That's the context of the book that you're appealing to, saying Jesus isn't the Lord. So again, what is your justification? Since you don't have the context of the book, what's your justification for saying Jesus is not the Lord according to Mark 1:3, the explicit statement? Is it something encoded there? Is it just some esoteric meaning that you read into it? How do you get out of it that he is not the Lord when Mark says he is the Lord?
So I'm granting that he's the Lord in this new Christian sense of the term the Lord, like the Lord Messiah, the Lord Christ, the one who God has made Lord in Christ. Not the Lord of the Old Testament, who's the one God. This is his Father.
Right. Who's Mark quoting?
I think your question presupposes that there isn't that distinction.
Who's Mark quoting in 1:3?
Mark 1:3. Well, we know it's a mashup of three texts.
Isaiah. He's quoting Isaiah in Mark 1:3. Okay.
That's right.
So what is the meaning? What does the meaning have there? When you read Isaiah 43, who is the Lord?
It's Yahweh.
Okay, so when Mark quotes it, he's giving it some new esoteric meaning.
He's thinking it has another fulfillment. Just like I said, read what scholars say about the New Testament use of the Old Testament.
If you've read what scholars say, then give me the argument that scholars gave you. They're apparently not helping you.
You seem to be assuming like a fundamentalist kind of position, like the meaning in the New Testament has to be the same as the meaning in the Old Testament original context.
Instead
everybody knows that's false.
You can say everybody knows that. Everybody, if you're going to appeal to the majority, Dale, and count noses, well, then you're the odd man out here. Unitarians are not the majority. Okay, give me the arguments. If you've read the scholars and they've convinced you of this, give me the evidence that convinced you of this. Quit just name dropping. What's the evidence?
You don't need scholars. Part of the burden of my case in this debate is you don't need scholars to help you see that this author does not confuse together Jesus and God. They're two characters.
Such as when he calls him the Lord in Mark 1:3, Mark 2:28.
Yeah, that's right.
Mark 11:3.
Yes.
Mark 5:19.
Yeah, because the background is we know there's
Mark
a new
12.
Christian use of the phrase ha kurios, the Lord. And it's not God,
there's
it's for Jesus.
there's a new. Okay, you just keep asserting
Within their
things. You don't
lexicon.
have the evidence for that. Now, I thought you sort of shot yourself in the foot, so I have to ask this here. You mentioned that you think what Mark is doing in this whole blasphemy thing, and I give you kudos here, Dale, for recognizing Mark 15:29 as actually a reference to blasphemy, whereas most translations don't render it explicitly. Throughout Mark's gospel, you actually have this dueling blasphemies. In Mark 2, they accuse Jesus of blasphemy. In Mark 3, he accuses them of blasphemy. In Mark 14, they accuse Jesus of blasphemy, but then in Mark 15, Mark accuses them of blasphemy. But you mentioned that they were blaspheming Jesus, and you said, that here they are, they're blaspheming God. Well, not that Jesus is God, but that's where I think you shot yourself in the foot. So you recognize that Mark himself is presenting Jesus as the one who's ultimately being blasphemed. How do you deal with that without just shuffling?
No, it's like,
who
I
are
mean,
they
this
blaspheming on the
is a
cross?
synoptic. If I can answer, this is a synoptic theme that, to receive the one sent is to receive the sender. To respect the one sent is to respect the sender, and to disrespect the one sent is to disrespect the sender. So they're blaspheming God by insulting God's special agent here, the Messiah.
Okay, so do you think that Son of God? Do you think Son of God and Messiah are synonymous terms?
No, I don't think they're synonymous, but I think they're both understood in this book to be titles of the Messiah. So they're co-referential. They're understood as co-referential, but the meaning is not exactly the same thing. Yeah.
Right. So Son of God would be a greater title or just an equivalent? What exactly does it say about Jesus?
The flavor of Son of God in this book, as many commenters point out, is royal, because you have the kings being referred to in like Psalm 2, I believe, and other places as, today I've made you my son.
And it doesn't say I've made you my son.
So that it goes along with the son of David and the King of the Jews theme, which are also titles of the Messiah.
You see it as equivalent to the title Christ. How come Mark repeatedly distinguishes these two titles?
No, it's not necessarily equivalent in meaning. Again, it's co-referential. They're both understood to be terms of Jesus. But for all I know, Mark believes in the miraculous conception. And so like in Luke 1, he may be using Son of God to mean that like God in a way kind of substitutes for a human father in Jesus's case.
Okay, so you said for all I know. So you don't get that from Mark, which is what we're debating. And if you want to appeal to the other Gospels, you're jumping out of the frying pan into the fire. The other Gospels most emphatically teach that Christ is Son of God in an ultimate divine sense. John 5:17 and 18 says Jesus was Son of God, thereby making himself out to be equal with God. John 10:30, they wanted to stone him for blasphemy because he was claiming to be God by saying that he was the Son of God. So that's not going to help you. Stick to Mark unless you want to, get grilled by John and the other synoptics. But in Mark's gospel, how does he define Son of God?
I don't think he defines it. I think he understands it just like the Jewish priest understands it to be a title of God's Messiah, like the Son of Man,
so there you go,
Son of David, and so on.
But there you go again, conflating the titles. The high priest does not conflate those two titles. He doesn't use a restrictive a positive there. He uses a form of a positive which understands Jesus not as just any old Christ, not Christ the Son of David, not Christ the Son of Aaron, but Christ the Son of God. It is that particular claim that the high priest charges as blasphemy. Why does the high priest think that's blasphemy? Is it blasphemy? You keep talking about what Jews believe. Was it blasphemy in the first century to claim to be the Christ?
What the scholars say, Mr. Rogers, is that it's unclear what the notion of blasphemy was there. And for all we can tell, just falsely scholar, to be God's Christ or to be coming on the clouds with God, to be presumptuously taking upon divine prerogatives would count as blasphemy in their eyes.
Anthony, let's allow Dr. Del Tuggy to respond to your answers, because it seems that you're cutting them off in mid-response. So let's allow for Doctor to respond to your
I can just tell when he's not answering. Anyways, but no you keep saying scholars this, scholars that. I mean, if you had the goods, you could present the evidence. Now I'm going to play your game. No scholar says that. No scholar says that it was blasphemy to claim to be the Christ. We can even look at the New Testament to prove that that's not the
What I
case. There were
said was
numerous
that they say it's unclear what the Jews are assuming about
there
blasphemy.
were
That's what I
numerous
said.
messianic pretenders in the first century mentioned in the New Testament. They're never accused of blasphemy, never put to death for blasphemy. Josephus, a first century witness, mentions numerous messianic pretenders. None of them were accused of blasphemy. Bar Kokhba was claimed to be a Messiah, never claimed, was said to be committing blasphemy. Jesus was. Why is that?
Like I said, I don't think it's clear how they define blasphemy. And notice you're just on a tear here with one detail, and you're ignoring what is in fact the main thesis of the book.
I tried to talk to you about the main thesis, and you obviously stumbled there. But okay, you said it's not clear from this book.
You told me something Richard Bauckham says.
I didn't tell you anything Richard Bauckham says. But in any case, the Mark 2, you said Mark doesn't tell us how they understand blasphemy, what blasphemy is. What do they say blasphemy is in Mark 2?
Why don't you tell me?
They said he was claiming to be God. Who does this man think he is? Who can forgive sins but God alone? So they understood blasphemy.
They're not saying he's claiming to be God. That's absurd. And the author doesn't say that. They're saying it was blasphemous to claim he can forgive sins. They're looking at him. They know he's not God. They're not saying he's claiming to be God.
So in their minds, what is blasphemy?
Presumably in that case, asserting this divine prerogative that you were not given, which is to forgive sins.
Okay, so
although they may have
Mark
the
15,
foolish view that God cannot possibly delegate that, they may be assuming that, which we know is false from the New Testament.
So in Mark 14, what do they mean by blasphemy? We have an established understanding now of what they understood by blasphemy. What is going on in Mark 14?
No, it doesn't follow that they have to be assuming the same thing about blasphemy in chapter 14 and chapter 2. Why would somebody think that?
So show me from Mark another.
Could just be a very vague notion of like disrespecting God.
How are they disrespecting? They're disrespecting God, or Jesus is?
It would be disrespecting God to falsely claim to be God's Messiah, or to falsely claim that you have authority on earth to forgive sins.
Okay, so I'll let that lie for right now. In Mark chapter 4, 5, and 6, Jesus reenacted the events of the Exodus, as I pointed out in my opening presentation. What do you think about that? Mark 4, Jesus rebukes and stills the wind and the waves, which are repeatedly ascribed to Yahweh in the Old Testament. That's what he did at creation and the Exodus. In Mark 5, he destroys a legion of demons, drowning them in the sea. In Mark 6, he feeds the multitude in the wilderness. All of these events are prototypical of what God did, and the Old Testament says God would do when he came in the future. How do you handle those texts?
Yeah, I'm not sure if those reflect this new Exodus idea or not. But the problem you have is that you're basically assuming it's impossible for God to give those powers to others. We know that's false because he does give the power to others to walk on water at least once. There's plenty of water miracles in the Old Testament, making a brick float, dividing the Red Sea, and so on. This is not a clear coded signal that Jesus is God himself.
Yeah, I think
in fact, we know he's not God himself. He's the Son of God. He's been telling us for chapters now by the time we get to this point.
You should drop the coded language, because so far I think you're the only one that's been appealing to things that are coded here. But in Mark 4, 5, and 6, Jesus does things not only that other people had done in the past, he does things that God distinctively did according to the Old Testament. He did it in the order God did it, and he did it in a way that Mark records using the exact same language that was used for God. So, and moreover, let me ask you this. So at the end
you think
of
you're
most
smarter
of
than
these,
the author. He knows what he's saying. You think that he's somehow
told you what the author is saying.
to draw the
Mark
conclusion
1:3.
that Jesus is God here.
I've already told you. We've already talked. Okay, if you want to keep appealing to what the author allegedly says, but not deal with what he actually said, I mean, that's not going to get us anywhere. In Mark 1:3, the author told you he's the Lord. You said, no, he's the one through whom the Lord is acting. There's only one person here who's agreeing with the narrator. In Mark 4, 5, and 6, in fact, in Mark 6, look at Mark 6. How does Jesus respond to the disciples when they're afraid and think they see a ghost?
It says it's me.
He doesn't say it's
man,
me.
in other words.
He says
Yes, he
ego emi. He says
Right.
ego emi. Right?
Mhm.
What does that mean, Dale?
It means it's me. It's idiomatic
It
Koine
doesn't
Greek
mean it's
for
me,
it's me or
according
it
to
is I
any-
or I'm the one. The
No,
conspiracy
it's
theorist
ego
will
in
read
me.
a divine statement here, but that's
All right.
that's just not responsible.
All right, that's time. All right, Dr. Dale Tucky, you're up for your 15-minute cross-examination of Anthony Rogers.
Okay, Mr. Rogers, do you think that God could empower you to walk on water?
Sure. I mean, I don't have a problem with
Good.
that. That's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
been the basis of my argument.
Good. Me too. And
I think
a
if
mere
Jesus
man
were
like Peter
present,
could be empowered.
yeah, not in Mark's gospel. That's not
Yeah.
the point Mark is making.
So do you think that God could empower you to rebuke the winds and the waves when you were out, on a fishing boat?
No, I think that's
or
a
something?
signature act of Yahweh according to the Old Testament. This is what God does in the Old Testament. It says, this proves that I am the Lord. And so if other people could do it, then it would mitigate the force of that as a divine token.
Okay, so you think it's impossible for God to empower another person to do that?
Yeah, I think there are things that are distinctive to God. There are things that God can't do, right? We say that God can do all things, but that's just shorthand. Let me give an answer. You don't want me interrupting
God
you.
can't lie and so on.
No, God can't lie. God can't deny himself. God couldn't create another God, right? He couldn't create another being that's omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and so forth. He alone is God. And so I think there are things that are distinctive to God that he couldn't communicate to a creature. Certain things are incommunicable.
Right. So you're claiming that an almighty, all-powerful, all-knowing being could not empower, say, Anthony Rogers to, say, be still, and it would make the wind and the waves be still. You're saying that's something that the omnipotent God can't do?
Well, I think you're confusing things. I mean, he could tell me to speak, but it wouldn't be me actually causing the action. God would be the one doing it. In Scripture, in Mark's gospel, that's not what's happening. You keep talking about Jesus being given authority. The one thing totally absent from Mark's gospel is any statement of Jesus doing anything by someone else's authority. It doesn't say that anywhere in the book.
Yes, he implies that it's by the authority of heaven, just like the ministry of John the Baptist.
You could say it's implied, but you keep criticizing.
Sometimes implications are just as clear as explicit statements, as you know.
Well, then quit complaining
look, if
when
you're
I
making
appeal
an
to something.
impossibility claim, Mr. Rogers, if you're making an impossibility claim about God, the way to show that something is impossible is to derive a contradiction from it. And I don't see how you derive a contradiction from this scenario. God tells Anthony Rogers, hey, in a minute, I want you to say, be still, and your words will thereby stop the storm. I don't see any contradiction there. And so your claim, is your claim just based on that only, here's the question, is your claim based only on that only God is described as doing it in the Old Testament?
Well, it's more than that. It's more than that. And so if you're paying attention, you'll hear this as like the fifth time I've said it. Jesus did what God did. Those things that God said are definitional of who he is and prove who he is. Throughout the Exodus, he says, I'm doing this so that you might know that I am the Lord. So these are signature acts of God. Jesus does what God says are signature acts. He does them in the exact order that God did them. And he does them in a way that Mark records the very language he takes from the Old Testament for Yahweh doing them and applies them to Jesus.
So walking on water, is that a signature act of God?
Well, I would say that it is in this sense, in Mark's context. Jesus is the one walking on the water. When you appeal to Matthew, Matthew is doing something else. It's obvious that Peter does not have this power because Peter begins to sink. It's because Jesus is present that he makes the water like a floor. But it's very different than what's going on in Mark. Mark is not presenting Jesus as walking by somebody else's power, as is the case with Peter. Jesus is doing all of this by his own prerogatives. He's the one exercising these prerogatives. Jesus gives authority in Mark. He's not the one given it. He is acting as Yahweh.
So that you know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. Yes, every reader understands that he's been given authority on earth as Son of Man. Here's my next question.
You say every reader understands that. We're having a debate.
I believe I'm questioning you. Do you think that I could empower you to literally forgive a monetary debt that someone owes me? Like, could I send you to the guy that owes me $100? And could I say, Anthony, if if he's sorry and humble, I authorize you to forgive the debt. Could I do that?
Well, first of all, you're assuming that Jesus was authorized, and you haven't
No, just
established
answer
that.
the
You just keep
question.
saying it.
I'm asking you a
Everybody
question
knows that.
about me and you.
Okay,
Could I
you're asking a
authorize you to
question based on a
forgive my
false
debt?
assumption. But yeah, you could do that, but that's different. God reserves
Okay.
the right to
Could
forgive
I
sins against
authorize
himself.
you to could I authorize you to forgive a wrong that somebody did against me?
Yes, but you couldn't authorize me to forgive sins against somebody else.
Okay. So then similarly, God could authorize Jesus to forgive sins, just like Jesus authorizes the apostles to forgive sins in John 20. I know it's not the same book. It's the same century. This is early Christianity.
Dale, the problem you have that you keep missing, if you want to
You
appeal
can't
to
cite the
John,
scribes as the authority for this idea that only God can forgive.
hold on. If you want to appeal to John, then I'll happily go to John. In John 20:23, the disciples are given authority. Who gives them the authority to forgive sins? Now, I understand that in a ministerial and declarative sense, not a magisterial sense. I think they're declaring divine forgiveness on the basis of repentance and faith. But who is it that gives them this authority according to verse 22? It's Jesus who gives them this authority. Moreover, why does
Right.
Jesus have this authority
Okay, wait, this
according
is
to
my
John?
questioning time. Yeah, just like Jesus authorizes
Just
them to
5
cast out
verses
demons
later,
in this
Dale,
gospel.
Jesus is called God by Thomas. That's why Jesus can authorize the
This is
disciples
another
to
debate.
exercise this ministerial
Mark
authority.
doesn't do that.
So if you
Let's
want
stick
to
with
appeal
Mark.
to John, then you're appealing to somebody who, is not your friend in this debate.
Yeah, that's a nice little debating point. Obviously, I understand him to be referring to the one Lord and the one God. So do you agree that apart from Jesus, the only person who's described in the New Testament walking on water is Peter?
Wait, ask that question again?
Aside from Jesus, do you agree that the only person in the New Testament who walks on water briefly is Peter?
Yeah, I agree. There's one other person who attempts this and fails.
Well, he does it for a little bit and then he fails. Yeah. Okay. So does it follow from that?
I think I could get
Peter can walk on water?
could get two steps.
And listen to my question, please. Does it follow that only Peter can walk on water?
Well, he failed again, but I mean, I'm not even sure what you think you're asking here.
What I'm asking is, because he's the only one described doing it, does it follow that he is the only person, again, other than Jesus, who could do that?
I think just like Jehovah delivered an entire nation through the waters of the Red Sea, could safely deliver an entire nation over the top of the waters. But it's only Jehovah that can do that. And Mark is presenting Jesus as Jehovah.
Total and complete misunderstanding of reading comprehension. Marlon, how much time do I have left?
You have 7 minutes.
Your time is at the top, about 7.5 minutes at the top of the screen.
7 minutes left or 3 minutes left?
About 7.5 minutes left.
7.5 minutes. Okay, great. Mr. Rogers, do you think that the one God is tripersonal?
Yes, but in our debate, we're focused on Jesus.
Yeah. So do you think that Jesus is tripersonal?
No.
Good. Okay, so there's a simultaneous difference between the one God and Jesus? Namely, that Jesus is not tripersonal and God is tripersonal?
It depends how you're using the term. In both cases, you're using the terms differently. I say that each person is the term God, and I think you know that. You've been around the block on this issue before. The question in our debate is whether Jesus is God. And by God, I mean that he bears the divine name, has divine essence and nature, has divine attributes, exercises divine prerogatives, all of which I've already proven on the basis of explicit Markan statements. He's
okay,
called
so
the
you're
Lord
saying
in
not
1:3.
that Jesus.
He's called the.
Let me get clarification here. Are you saying not that Jesus just is the one God, like they're one and the same, but you're saying that Jesus is very closely related to the one God, like they share the same essence?
No, well, you've conflated a number of confusions there. What I'm saying is that Jesus is the fullness of deity in the flesh.
So when you say Jesus is the one God, you just mean that Jesus is divine and not merely human.
I mean that Jesus is by essence all that his Father is.
Right. You don't mean that he's the Trinity, so you don't really mean that he's the one God.
All three persons share that same divine essence. Let me put it this way. If you want to be philosophical, although we're not, this isn't a philosophical discussion. If you want to be philosophical, I believe that all three persons are numerically identical to the divine essence, but numerically distinct from each other as to their personhood. I don't conflate being and personhood.
Okay, so you define the Trinity as implying an obvious bunch of contradictions, because if they're identical to the same thing, they're identical to each other. That's just how identity works.
No, I made it very clear. They're identical as to their essence. They're distinct as to their personhood. Personal properties are distinct from the divine essence.
So you think one and the same God can be tripersonal and not?
Yeah, Dale, welcome to Orthodox
One and the same God can be Father.
The church has been confessing this for 20 centuries now.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah, it is nice.
I happen to know something about this. Okay, so when you say Jesus is God, you don't mean that he just is the one God. You mean that he has a divine nature. I take it that's your meaning, following the creeds.
I gave you my meaning. You don't have to, swap words out. I believe Jesus is
But he's identical to the divine nature, the divine essence, and so is the Father.
He is the Lord, Mark 1:3, Mark 2:28, Mark 5:19, Mark 11:3. He is the Lord.
He just is the Lord, and the Father just is the Lord too, right?
Mark does not present these two things as problematic, that you see as problematic. Mark has no problem.
This isn't philosophical, by the way. This is just what the heck the actual thesis is that you're arguing for. You say that Jesus, a minute ago, you just said that Jesus just is the divine essence. And you also say so are the other person. So the Father just is the divine essence. Okay, but things identical to the same thing are identical to one another. So it follows that Jesus just is the Father and can't differ from the Father in any way.
What follows is that you're not following
transitivity of
all
identity.
of what I said. You're trying to derive a contradiction from half of what I said and then inserting the other half that you just make up. I didn't simply
the other half
say
doesn't
that
help
they were
once
identical.
you get contradictions.
I said the persons are numerically identical as to their essence, numerically distinct as to their personhood. And so it's irrelevant for you to say things that are numerically identical to each other are just the same thing. They are one as to their essence, distinct as to their personhood.
Are you endorsing a theory of divine
as to his personhood?
Are you endorsing relative identity theory, so that like Jesus and the Father are the same being but different persons?
I'm advocating Orthodox Trinitarianism, which precedes all of your philosophical mumbo jumbo.
Yeah, wouldn't it be
which
nice
isn't even in view in Mark's gospel. Mark simply identifies Jesus as the Lord, and that's what I'm defending in this debate. That doesn't require understanding him as the Father, although the Father too.
So do you think that
Lord.
Mark? Do you think that Mark assumes, like Paul, that Jesus is essentially immortal?
Yeah, he is immortal as to his divine nature, of course.
Do you think Mark presents Jesus as only dying in his human nature and not his divine nature?
Well, that's not the way I would put it. It was a divine person who became incarnate. So a divine person experienced death in and by means of that human nature that was united in himself. United.
Right. I know what orthodoxy says. I know what the right answers are supposed to be. But as far as what Mark says, where does Mark say or imply or assume that there is a divine nature that goes on living while there's a human nature that dies?
Well, I mean, in the first place,
see one character there who dies.
Hold on, slow down. If you're going to ask a question that Mark doesn't address every question that we all have. We have the rest of the New Testament to try and tackle a lot of these sorts of things. But Mark does make it clear that Jesus has power over life and death. Jesus raised the Syrophoenician woman's daughter in Mark chapter 7. Jesus, exercises this divine prerogative.
Later too. Okay, I want to go on to a different question.
Not just like the apostles did. The apostles did it by having authority conferred on them.
Yes.
Mark never mentions Jesus having authority conferred
by the power
on him
of God's Spirit in both cases. My next question is Jesus's confessed lack of knowledge when he says only the Father knows the day or the hour. Do you take that at face value, that literally Jesus does not know, does not know in any way?
No, that's not how I understand it. Your reading of that, I mean, there's, I think I know what you're talking about, right? It's common for it's common. I mean, first of all, I think it's funny because I think you're an open theist.
So no, you don't understand it that way. Don't comment on what a goofball I am. Just answer the question. So
Yeah,
he does
okay,
he does know the day or the
obvious,
hour,
so I
just
won't
not in a
comment on it.
certain way?
No,
You think he does
take
know
the
the day or
term
the
know
hour?
there to be. You want me to answer? You got 30 seconds. I take the
Go.
word there to be used in a declarative sense, the same way Paul uses it in 1 Corinthians 2:2. Paul said, "I determined not to know anything among you except Christ and Him crucified."
Okay.
This was a well-known Jewish,
Yeah,
figure
this
of
is
speech.
Augustine's fallacious misreading. Yeah, I know this.
You can call it a fallacious
Look, that makes
misreading,
Jesus
but
a
if I had
liar.
more
If
time,
Jesus
I'd be happy
really
to
does
defend
know
it.
it and he says he doesn't know it without qualification, then he's a liar, because he knows that his hearers will
Well,
understand
if
him
you're
to
going
be
to
saying that he
misrepresent my
doesn't know it in
argument,
any
then you're a
way.
liar, because that's not what I said.
I know
didn't say
the
Jesus really
Augustine
knows it. He
reading
says he didn't.
All
that
right,
he just
guys.
means that he's not declaring
All right,
it. Yeah, I know
time
that.
has expired. It's getting a little chippy, you guys. I heard both of you guys throw a little, I will almost consider ad hominems at each other. So let's make sure that we're being cordial and respectful to each other so we can make sure we have a good conversation, okay?
Hey, we're still having coffee together. We have to be a little uppity in these things. I don't take these things personal. I'm going to go to bed tonight without thinking anything about what Dale called me.
It's I'm having an argument here with Mr. Rogers. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. What's the problem?
Yeah.
I love it. I love
We're
it.
not
Good
mad
stuff,
at each
guys.
other.
All right. So now we're going to transition to a more open discussion for about 20 minutes. So you guys got it, man. Have a free-flowing conversation.
Yeah, let's finish
we've
this
kind of been
business
doing
about
that.
Jesus. Tell me what you think I was misunderstanding about your Augustinian take on that passage where he doesn't know the day or the hour.
You're saying Augustinian, but I really don't think you're familiar with the extent to which this was a patristic interpretation. So here's what I would say. First of all, the vast majority of Christians would probably say that this statement in Mark 13:32 is resolved in terms of Christ's two natures, as both God and man. As God, he knows all things, just like as God, he's everywhere. As man, he is limited, has human attributes and characteristics, and so doesn't know everything, but grew in wisdom and so forth. While it's certainly true that Jesus had two natures and has the attributes and characteristics distinctive to those natures, and so can be spoken of from both vantage points, I don't think that's what's going on in Mark 13. Throughout Mark's gospel, Jesus is being presented as the bride of his people, the bridegroom. And by the way, am I still coming in clearly? Because it looks like I'm pausing a little bit. Okay, sorry.
I hear you.
So Jesus is called the bridegroom in Mark 2. Throughout the book, it's mounting up to this idea that Jesus is taking a people for himself, just like Jehovah in the Old Testament, by the way, who's called the bridegroom of his people. But Jesus is going to come back for his bride, and that's what the discussion is in Mark 13. Jesus returning as the Lord of the house, as the bridegroom of his people, inaugurating a great marriage feast. In a first century context, when a Jewish son was going to go and get his bride, it was a father's prerogative to declare the day and the hour. Nobody else had the right to declare that day. That didn't mean that the son didn't know it. It just meant that it wasn't his prerogative to declare it. That's how I understand it in Mark 13:32, in light of first century Jewish wedding customs, as well as the fact that that's what's being talked about there in the context. And that's a usage that's found throughout the New Testament, or it's found throughout Scripture, especially the hiphil form of the word know as used in the Old Testament. And I already quoted a New Testament passage about this. Right? In 1 Corinthians 2:2, Paul said, I resolve to know nothing among you except Christ and him crucified. Paul didn't literally mean he doesn't know the day or the hour. An Old Testament example would be Deuteronomy 4:9, where God tells the people of Israel that they're to know them to your children, meaning God's wondrous acts.
I recognize the usage here.
It.
But what he's saying here doesn't fit that at all. First of all, neither the narrator nor anybody else says, oh, okay, well, I guess he just can't declare it. But look, it's not his point is that only the Father knows it. His point is that only the Father knows it, not that only the Father declares it. That doesn't come into it. It's talking about a lack of knowledge.
Dale, that's what you're claiming, Dale, but I'm giving you a different interpretation.
Neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but
I'm
only
telling
the
you
Father.
how the word know functions.
Dale
there.
Claiming that he doesn't, that he's claiming lack of knowledge there.
You're
saying not knowing means I'm not like empowered to declare it. I'm not authorized to declare it.
That's how the term know is being used. That's how
authorized
Paul literally.
That's not in
so let
view.
me ask you a
It
question.
is what is it in view is
You're
the
claiming
traditional
it's not
Jewish
in view,
assumption
but I just
that
gave you
Jesus knows
arguments for it.
Sorry, that God knows everything. That's what's in view.
Okay, Dale, you're ignoring my explanation and then just reinserting your own interpretation of the word "know" there. It's fine if we disagree on the meaning of the word "know," but you can't just pretend that I'm sharing. I'm just making something up
Not
over
to have
here.
heard my comeback. The issue is not that the Father has the privilege of declaring it. There's no hint of that in the text.
That's how the term "know" is functioning. That's my point.
Yeah, this is
when Paul said, "I
you
resolve
can
to
find,
know."
You can find Irenaeus and other early Christians who just say, "Yeah, the Father's greater in knowledge." He says the Father's greater than I, and specifically, he's greater in knowledge, and they're pointing precisely to this passage. And they don't all know about this magical save, where it just has knowing just has to do with declaring.
First of all, I think you're misrepresenting Irenaeus, but the point that I made, there's a variety of interpretations among Christians. Some resolve it in terms of Christ's tutors. That's not the resolution. I don't think that that's false as far as, Christ having two natures and therefore, two sets of attributes in accordance with those natures. But what I'm telling you is this fits the first century Jewish custom. It fits what's going on in the context. It fits not only Old Testament, but New Testament usage of the term "know." The term "know" often is used in a declarative sense. For you to ignore my observation about
this widespread two natures explanation tells me that my understanding, which is very straightforward, is correct. That is why everybody has to labor to overcome the obvious meaning of it. So yeah, I understand your suggestion. I don't find it plausible. I guess the listeners can judge.
Yeah, they can judge because Jesus is presented in Mark's gospel as not only a man, the Christ, but also as the Lord, Mark 1:3, Mark 2:28, Mark 5:19. But now let me ask you a question, since we've gone back and forth a little bit on your question. In Mark chapter 2, we're told that Jesus knew the hearts of the Pharisees. He knew what they were reasoning in their hearts. Is this a signature act of Yahweh according to the Bible, or is this one of those things that you say is not a signature act of Yahweh? It's just something anyone can do if God gives them the power. What does the Bible say?
It can be both. It can be both. It can be something that's distinctive of Yahweh. And he says, there's a few Old Testament passages that say, "Hey, I'm the one who knows the hearts of men." And yet it's clear that sometimes prophets get supernatural knowledge and know what's going on in the hearts of men. So my observation about that is just look, if Mark wants to communicate that Jesus is God because he knows the hearts of men, he can have the narrator say it. He can have the good guy say it. He can have the bad guy say it. He can just say it by clear implication. He just passes it all by.
Or he could use the exact same language used for Jehovah that should have been familiar to any person in the first century, and that would have been an obvious tip-off, rather than somebody just dismissing. But what does the Old Testament itself say? Does it simply say that God? Wait, does it simply say that God knows the hearts? And give me an example of anybody knowing the hearts of men. Where are you looking at?
Where's the exact passage you're looking at?
For 8.
2:8. Why do you raise such questions in your hearts? He perceived in his spirit they were discerning these questions.
1 Kings
I thought we were on chapter
verse 39. 2. Yeah,
okay.
Well, let me quote this. 1 Kings 8:39 says, "You alone know the hearts of the sons of men." Okay? This is a signature act of God. This is something that he claims to have the sole prerogative to do. Mark chapter 2 says Jesus knew the hearts of the religious leaders, what they were reasoning in their hearts.
Right. Yeah.
In a context where they're accusing him of blasphemy for doing what only God can do. So here you have not only the Pharisees accusing Jesus of blasphemy for claiming a divine prerogative, an exclusive divine prerogative. You even have Mark saying that Jesus did something which the Old Testament says God alone can do. Do you really think that Mark is saying he's just a man, fellas?
Yes, I really do think, I wouldn't call the Christ just a man, but look, by distinguishing Jesus from God in all the ways I mentioned in my opening statement, that's an inoculation to keep you from confusing Jesus with God, like, say, the modalistic monarchians or a oneness person would confuse them. And the differences tell you that they're not the same.
Dale.
And so,
This is why. Okay, if you want to keep talking, this isn't a conversation. I'll just keep talking.
Go ahead.
I'll just keep talking if you're going to keep talking, Dale. So you keep saying if Jesus is called the Lord, he can't be the Lord because he's constantly distinguished from the Lord in the book. But I might just as well play the same game. He's not truly the Lord because Jesus is always called Lord in the book. And so all these other occasions must just mean that he's
There's not one meaning of Lord. You're not making any sense. There's not one meaning of Lord.
Of course I'm making sense. In Mark 1:3, it's an Old Testament text about the Lord, who is Yahweh, by your admission, being applied to Jesus. I'm not giving it a new meaning. You are. You're giving it a new meaning, not me.
This is just
so
a
Mark
typical New
1:3 calls
Testament
Jesus
use of an
the
Old
Lord.
Testament passage, just like Psalm 110:1, like we discussed already.
Yeah, we discussed it, and you utterly failed to neutralize the significance of that testimony to Christ's deity. You appealed fallaciously to a double fulfillment, which you couldn't prove, which contradicted the way Jesus uses that text. So back to the issue. How do you deal
the way
with
that
Jesus
uses that text?
being called?
Look up what scholars say about Psalm 110.
What did Jesus say
and
about
about
Psalm
New
110?
Testament use of Old Testament passages.
Forget your unnamed scholars who haven't given you any evidence that you can use in this debate because you haven't used it. You just keep dropping well, I would say you're dropping their names, but you haven't mentioned a single name. Tell me, name for me.
It's better than these half-baked confusions of Jesus with God, which are refuted by all the differences between Jesus and God in this book. Jesus can't be God. He dies.
What differences? What differences? Such as Jesus being the one
because he talks to God as somebody else. He worships God. He prays to God. He's not God.
He talks to his Father. The Father talks to Jesus. Does that mean the Father isn't God? Yeah. Jesus is called the Lord. The Father talks to Jesus. Therefore, not the Lord. That's your form of argumentation.
Yeah, the question anachronistically assumes that you can. The question anachronistically assumes that you can read this book using the idea of multiple persons in God, and that just didn't happen in the first century. It happened in the 4th century. It's not even in Irenaeus. It's not even in Origen.
Dale, what I'm talking about is found throughout the ancient fathers. The only person who cited any fathers in this debate is me, even though I don't need to. We're debating Mark's gospel.
The ancient fathers don't make this mistake of thinking that Jesus is God because of this prophecy. They don't. They have the Logos as a lesser divine being. They call him a second God. Justin calls him a second God. Origen says he's two in number, and so on.
I don't agree with your erroneous interpretations of the fathers, and not really debating.
It's a good thing because one of us knows more than the other about the church fathers. But continue.
Sound like I lost.
All the church fathers, father, happy to do that. One of us even quoted.
Yeah, Anthony, it sounds like you're going in and out. Look like we might have lost your feed there. You're going in and out.
Numerous. Who is? Am I here?
Yeah, it looked like we lost you for a minute. I think your audio's still there, but your video's frozen.
Okay. Well, if you could, I'm good. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, you're still going in and out.
Should I come back in?
All right, look like your audio came back now.
Should I go out and come back in?
Yeah, you could go out, come back in. Yeah, you could log out and come back in, Anthony. Sorry about that, Dale. It's probably just their internet signal.
Yeah, no problem.
Should be coming back here soon. Sorry, everyone. We're working on that, trying to get everything back. Where is it? We're just waiting for. There he is. Anthony, you back? You good?
I'm back. I'm good.
All right. So we can continue on where we left off at.
Okay. Let's talk about authority, Dale. We haven't really done that too much. You hear me?
I'm hearing, yes. Mhm.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if we were frozen again or not. Um, actually, we're talking about knowledge. I gave an interpretation of Mark 13:32 that you disagree with, which is fine. We're probably not going to be able to resolve that between us today. Either way, there are two viable options as a Trinitarian that are open to me: either resolving it in terms of Christ's true nature, or recognizing the first century historical context of Jewish weddings, that the term "know" can be used in a declarative sense and is in the New Testament. But I pointed to Mark 2, where Jesus knows the hearts of men, which the Old Testament says is a signature act of Yahweh. God alone does this. This is an identifiable prerogative of God. What's some other examples throughout Mark where Jesus knows things? For example, Mark 3, we're told that Jesus knows that the people, in fact, in Mark 3, it says that Jesus looked around at the people and was grieved at their hardness of heart. Before they do anything, Jesus looks at them and is grieved by their hardness of heart. Do you have anything in the Old Testament where any prophet you've claimed that this is something that other people did? Any example of somebody knowing the hearts in the Old Testament?
Off the top of my head, I can't think of how that phrase is used for a prophet. But look, we're all familiar with prophets, that they can have supernatural knowledge given to them. They can even speak first person on behalf of God. They can pronounce judgment and so on. They can do all kinds of shocking things that are considered a prerogative of God.
Not when the scriptures say that God alone. This is true. God alone, but
to interpret that in a sense where it's like metaphysically impossible for God to share is just flat and overreading. It's not justified by that statement that God alone does that. Especially given what we see in this book.
Look,
chapter 2. This is the clearest point. This is the clearest statement, I think, about authority. He says, "But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." And when he calls himself the Son of Man, he's calling himself human, first of all, but also he's referring back to that guy, to that one like a Son of Man in Daniel 7, who's distinguished from God. This one who in the future is going to get all this wonderful stuff given to him by God. So when he says that the Son of Man has authority on earth, he doesn't say that I as God have authority on earth, which would be a very easy thing to say, by the way.
Okay, so
he's saying that as somebody else, I have obviously been given by God this authority. And that's how most interpreters read this book.
Yeah. So let's note a number of problems for your thesis there, Dale. Not only have we these two references in this very context to Jesus doing things that only God can do, forgiving sins and knowing the hearts of men, something admitted not only by the Pharisees, whom Mark is presenting as a foil for Christ's claim, but also by the Old Testament, 1 Kings 8, God alone can know the hearts of men. But in this context, when Jesus says he has authority on earth to forgive sins, and he refers to himself as the Son of Man, you say this is with reference to Daniel 7, which I agree with, and you said in light of this future authority that he would be given. But here Jesus is already exercising this authority, and moreover, the very description of the Son of Man, the reason it's so puzzling to Daniel is precisely because this Son of Man is being described in patently language. The Son of Man comes up to the Ancient of Days riding the clouds of heaven. Once again, this is a signature act of Yahweh. Deal with the passages, that deal with this.
Yeah, it's not Yahweh. Yahweh is the Ancient of Days. This one is brought to Yahweh. It's patently two different ones. And to say that, he's coming on the clouds,
there's no question that it deals with two persons. There's no question that it deals with two persons, but you're assuming that God himself is only unipersonal, which I don't grant.
There's no question that in the first century, there's no idea of God as multi-personal. And that is why you cannot import that 4th century idea into this 1st century book. And I don't buy your fringe views that somehow all the Jews thought this. You don't even see it in the New Testament, Anthony. You don't see in the New Testament the Jews treating God as multi-personal. He's the Father, he's the King, etc. It's a singular personal pronoun.
Well, in the first place, you can call it a fringe view, but between us, the only person who actually has a background and education in Judaism is me. Besides that, I could easily quote the Targums referring to more than one divine person. I could quote Genesis 1:26, where they say the divine us is a reference of God, his word, and his Shekhinah, his spirit. They're having
Yes, I'm
a
aware of
reference
these
to three
intermediary
persons.
figures. Yep.
Not intermediary. It's three persons being addressed by the Father, his word and his glory, his spirit. That's precisely the Trinitarian position. That's why Talmudic scholars like Daniel Boyarin or Alan Siegel, a Second Temple Jewish scholar, numerous other scholars say that first century Second Temple Jews did in fact believe in more than one divine person. So if you want to talk about fringe scholarship, it must be the unnamed scholars you keep referring to. But back to Daniel 7.
Yeah, no, it's
Deuteronomy
pick up an
33 says
introductory
that
book on Old Testament theology. They'll say
rides the
the
heavens
Trinity
to
is
your
not in the
help.
Old Testament. End
2
of
Samuel
sentence.
22:11 says he appeared on the wings of the wind. 18:10 says he sped upon the wings of the wind. Over and over again, it speaks of God as the one who rides the Isaiah 19:1. So the Son of Man in Daniel 7 is being portrayed in a way that the Testament portrays Yahweh. What's unique about this, a man. And that's why Daniel
That's an
marvels
absurd
over
misunderstanding to think that the Son, one like a Son of Man, is Yahweh himself. This is why traditional interpreters would think it was the Messiah or even a personification of Israel. It's not God.
What do you mean by
the
traditional
one like a Son of
interpreters?
Man. Jewish interpreters in these times.
Name
They're
one.
taking it
Name one Jewish
in some
interpreter.
cases as a divine intermediary, in other cases as a Messiah, in other cases,
In some cases
as
a divine intermediary.
yes, like you see in Philo, for instance. Although he's utterly
so
confused, his divine powers sometimes are intermediaries and sometimes they're divine attributes.
So far, the only name we've had for a position ends up being closer to mine and not yours. You've given us one name for these beliefs, Philo, and his position's closer to mine than yours.
The problem with your position is you think you're smarter than Mark, and you think that Mark is saying a bunch of things that Mark is not saying. That's the fundamental problem with your position.
All right, guys, that's time right there. So now we're going to transition to closing remarks. Thank you for the fiery and educational and entertaining cross-examination. I do appreciate you guys for that, for the interaction. So now we're going to transition to closing statements. Once again, these are 5-minute closings. And Anthony Rogers, you're up for your 5-minute closing.
All right. Throughout this debate, I have tried to focus on Mark's gospel, which is actually the topic of our debate. In Mark's gospel, we are emphatically told that Jesus is the Lord. For this reason, we don't have to fish around for other explanations for why Jesus is able to say and do things that the Lord alone can do. Mark explicitly calls Jesus the Lord in Mark 1:3. He explicitly calls him the Lord in 2:28. He explicitly calls him the Lord in Mark 5:19 and 20. He explicitly calls him the Lord in Mark 11:3. He ascribes to Jesus divine attributes and prerogatives. Jesus forgives sins, which only God can do. Jesus knows the hearts of men, which only God does. Jesus not only is able to do things that are exclusive to God, according to the Old Testament, not simply some kind of philosophical speculation about what God could allow or not allow, but according to the Old Testament, what God alone can do, Jesus does. And in fact, in accordance with Old Testament anticipation about the new Exodus, that God would come again and do a greater work than he had performed in the future, Mark shows us Jesus reenacting the events of the Exodus. He shows Jesus delivering the disciples from the sea in Mark 4, destroying a legion of demons by drowning them in the water in Mark 5, then feeding a multitude of Israelites in the wilderness in Mark 6. Then he has Jesus repeating these acts all over again at the end of Mark 6, into Mark 7, into Mark 8. And after Jesus does this twice over, delivering them from the sea, destroying Satan's hosts, and feeding them in the wilderness, Jesus takes them up the mountain where he transfigures himself before the disciples, showing his essential heavenly glory. And then the Father echoes the words that he spoke in Exodus 23 about the divine name-bearing messenger. In Exodus 23, the one the Father calls Jehovah and tells Moses and the Israelites to listen to, Mark uses the exact same language that were spoken to Moses on the mountain. Listen to him. There's no question, in light of the explicit statements as well as these narrative reenactments, who Mark is identifying Jesus to be. Jesus is the Lord. Now, for Dale, none of these things can possibly mean any of that because Dale assumes Unitarianism. If Jesus is distinguished from the Father, then Jesus can't be the Lord, even though Mark explicitly says that. But the fact of the matter is that if we want to start assuming things, that I might just as well move in the other direction. Because Mark explicitly calls Jesus the Lord and shows him saying and doing what the Lord did do and alone can do, then the Father must not be that Lord. But that, of course, is absurd, and that's the absurd world of Unitarianism. Throughout this debate, I've demonstrated that these things are plain both on the surface as well as by obvious implication. Dale, on the other hand, has had to read things into the text. Instead of the text saying that Jesus is the Lord, the text means he's one through whom the Lord was acting. But that's not what Mark says. That's what Dale reads into it. Dale says that these interpretations come from much later. But the fact of the matter is, not only can they be observed in Mark's gospel itself, but the earliest fathers said the same things I'm saying. And I didn't have to simply say that fathers said this or that. I could actually quote them. But again, my appeal in this debate has been to Mark's gospel, not to other unnamed individuals, certainly not 17th century Unitarians. Dale complains in numerous ways that Jesus can't be God because he was tempted, even though the Old Testament says God was tempted in the wilderness, Exodus 17. He says all sorts of things. Jesus died. All these things that supposedly mean he can't be God. But remember, this is how people in the narrative objected to Jesus. This is the carpenter's son, Mark 6. This man, we know his brothers and sisters. If he were truly who he claims to be, he'd come down from the cross. But don't you see, the whole point is that Jesus is the Lord who has come for this very purpose, to rescue his people by dying for them. The proper response of Dale is not to perpetuate the blasphemy of those who mocked Jesus and his divine claims when he was on the cross, but to repent and believe the gospel.
All right.
The
All right,
proper
Anthony,
response.
that's time right there. That's time.
Okay.
All right, Dale, you're up for your 5-minute closing.
Okay. The listener should pay attention to the methodological differences on display in this debate. My position about Mark is based on what it clearly says and does not say, and on what sort of book it is. No interpretive voodoo is required. My opponent misreads the very thesis of this book, not even realizing that his interpretation requires two theses, a hidden thesis and a surface one. He just can't see the actual surface thesis that Jesus is not God himself, but this human Messiah. And he imagines that being called Lord or doing things that God does in the Old Testament assumes that Jesus is the one God himself. He simply assumes that an all-powerful being can't authorize others to do such things. And so he derives a bunch of conclusions that our author never does. For me, Mark is a book which was intended to be understood even by 12-year-olds or adults with little to no education, and it succeeds brilliantly. My position about Jesus and God is clear and can be clearly stated in biblical language. The one true God of the New Testament is the Father alone, and so not anyone else. The man Jesus is his Messiah, a uniquely important agent who has now been raised and exalted to be the one Lord under the one God. In contrast, my opponent is wedded to the whole traditional Catholic morass about multiple hypostases sharing one ousia, and Christ is somehow composite of divine nature plus a human nature, whatever those are. That way lies a pit of unfruitful and unending speculations which do nothing to clarify New Testament teaching. For details, see my published work on the many Trinity theories and my debate book with Chris Date or my lecture Clarifying Catholic Christologies. Now, unfortunately, he's stood up for an absurd interpretation of Mark's views about God and Jesus. He says that here Jesus just is God and the Father just is God, and yet Jesus is not the Father. That's just nonsense. Things that are identical to the same thing are identical to one another. That's just basic logic. My debate opponent does not care about seeming incoherence. That's for heretics to worry about. But in ceasing to care about seeming incoherence, he devalues both truth and our God-given critical thinking abilities by which we separate the false from the true. He hunkers down with a few misread texts, rickety arguments, and fringe scholarship, and poses as a noble defender of the faith, declining to answer simple questions of clarification about how God and Jesus are supposed to be related, but you might, and how they could possibly differ, given that they're both the same God. But you, my friends, should run towards the hard questions, such as, why, if Mark thinks Jesus is God, does he never get around to saying that? Imagine that the gospel according to Mark was the only Christian scripture. If this were so, would Christians, based on this one scripture, have come up with the idea that Jesus is God? Would they have reasoned like Mr. Rogers today, arguing that, he does things that God does and he's called Lord, so he must be God? It's hard to imagine that happening. And that is because Mark only presents him to be God's Christ, not God. He never says or implies or assumes that Jesus is divine the way the one God is divine. This idea is no more in this first century book than the idea of the internet is in the writings of Thomas Jefferson. Worse, on the face of it, no passage, even at first glance, sounds like it implies that Jesus is the one true God or is fully divine. There's nothing in the book to worry Socinus, William Ellery Channing, or Sir Anthony Buzzard. Part of what's going on, I think, is that the very Catholic Protestants, like my opponent, find it jarring that in their view, Paul and John teach that Jesus is God, while on the face of it, the synoptics don't. One would like to think that early Christians, a very small movement, had their story straight and are not disagreeing about who God and Jesus are. So then these overly Catholic Protestants simply squeeze the synoptic gospels with all their might, hoping to produce just a drop of deity of Christ from them. But it doesn't work. It's better you should see how the New Testament authors really are consistent about God and Jesus by carefully re-examining what Paul and John and Peter and the authors of Hebrews and Revelation actually say. It turns out that biblical Unitarian Christians like me love these books as much as we love Mark. Further Reformation is the way forward. It's better to do that than to cling to the 16th century Reformation as if it went far enough. New Testament theology doesn't need clarifications from ecumenical councils. If you're a Christian who has realized that mainstream Protestantism is far too Catholic in its theology and Christology, I encourage you to check out UnitarianChristianAlliance.org, specifically our resources and our growing community. This is a real and dynamic 21st century Reformation in which believers go back to the apostolic sources, and by God's grace, the distorting creedal scales are falling from our eyes. Thank you.
All right. Thank you both for the closing remarks. And so now we're going to transition to our Q&A. And we have a whole bunch of Q&As. Everyone out there, there's a lot of super chats. So if you didn't ask a question without a super chat, I'm not sure that I'll be able to get to your question. I'm sorry, but we are going to jump into this. And you see it pop up on the bottom of the screen here. All right, question from Skylar. Thank you for the super chat, Skylar. Appreciate you. This is for both. Please have both comment on explanation of I me in Mark 13:32 according to Basil of Caesarea, Epistle 2:36 to follow.
I'm not familiar with that passage
as well. Hold on one second. There's a quote here. I think he quoted something as well here. And it says, not even the Son would have known unless the Father had known. The cause of the Son's knowledge is from the Father.
Yeah, so Dale's not, I'll answer this first. Dale's not familiar with this, which I find ironic because he pretended to know the patristic interpretations of this. But what he's referring to is in the Greek, it says "ame," which means if not. In other words, the Son would not have known if the Father had not. That was his interpretation. So that's one of the other interpretations out there. And there are scholars who say that's a viable interpretation. The one I offered in this debate, but it's another one that's on the floor.
All right.
Yeah, I was going to give a short answer there. Yeah, it sounds like it's a version of the two natures answer, which unfortunately makes Jesus a liar, because if he knows it in his divine nature, then what he says obviously misleads everybody who's hearing him, because he just says he doesn't know it.
He's misrepresenting the Father. The Father is not saying at all what Dale is saying. Dale is pigeonholing his interpretation. He's giving an entirely different one. He's appealing to the Greek grammar.
If you've got the quote, feel free to give it to us.
I'll give you the argument. The argument is that in the Greek, it says "ame," which means if not, the Father alone. So it's because the Father knows, the Son does know, is his argument.
All right. So with the initial question, I'm gonna give a 1 minute response to the first person, and then 1 minute comment. The person come behind and comment for 1 minute as well. We have a lot of questions. I do want to pound through these questions real quick. All right. This is for Anthony. Anthony, how can you say Yeshua is God when he said the Father is alone? Monin in Greek. True God and his own God he goes to.
Okay, sounds like a conflation of several passages. This is a Unitarian favorite. It's not found in Mark's gospel. It's found in John 17:3. In John 17:3, Jesus, referring to the Father, says, "You, this is eternal life, that they might know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent." Unitarians fallaciously assume that the word alone, monon, there is modifying the word Father, and so means the Father alone is the true God. But the word alone modifies the word true, which further modifies the word God. In other words, Jesus is saying the Father is the only true God, something that every Christian Trinitarian believes. He's not saying that the Father alone is the only true God. That is not what's going on there in the Greek grammar.
All right, Dale.
Yeah, well, every translator seems to disagree with Mr. Rogers there.
That
seems to be precisely what it's saying. And this is why Trinitarians have wondered about this. Why doesn't he say the Father and Son are the one true God, or Father, Son, and the Spirit are the one true God? That's more what a Trinitarian would expect in the passage.
All right. Next question. Well, it's more of a statement, but I got to talk to this individual. I don't know if he meant to give a super chat for this, but I'll talk to him. Why do you not let your debater opponents answer questions, Anthony? What you doing, man?
Well, I was tempted to interrupt you as you were asking that question, just to keep stride here. Well, usually in debate, the person's asking a question designed to get a certain answer. When I hear the person giving the answer and already think I got the point that they're making, I try and come back in to further the discussion. I'll grant, though, that there are times when I might be over animated and, write a little roughshod over Dale while he's speaking. I mean, I'll freely grant that.
Dale, did Anthony interrupt you too much, man? What's up, man?
I have no comment on that question. Let's move on.
All right, no problem. All right.
Again, I should have interrupted.
Thank you, Stanford Scripture, for the super chat. Appreciate you. Anthony, this is for you again. You say only God can do things. Yeshua claims that he does this. He does what he does is the Father in him and does his works. How do you explain?
Okay, let's remember a couple of facts here. We are debating the Gospel of Mark, okay? And I've tried as much as I can to stay in the Gospel of Mark and not appeal to things outside of that. Dale has gone outside of it quite a bit. In Mark's Gospel, he never says anything of the sort. Where he does say that sort of thing is in the Gospel of John. But that's not the gospel you want to turn to in order to try and trump what Mark is teaching. In John's gospel, Jesus is explicitly identified as Theos ein halagos, John 1:1, and God was the Word, John 1:18. God, the one and only who's at the Father's side, he has made him known. Repeatedly, Jesus is called God in the Gospel of John. And so when it talks about the Father being in him, that's exactly what I would expect as a Trinitarian. All three persons of the Trinity are always involved in and with the other persons of the Trinity. So that doesn't discount my position. It rather is part and parcel of it. So if we go to Mark's gospel, though, you don't find this sort of discussion. That's found in John, where Jesus is emphatically called God. Just like when you go to Mark, he's emphatically called Lord.
All right. Dale, any thoughts?
Yeah, the debate's about Mark, not John. And the important thing, I think, to see is that this author does not draw the conclusions that my debate opponent draws. So, and to cite the scribes in chapter 2 is just wrong. They're wrong that he's blasphemed, and they're wrong that only God can forgive sins. This clearly is a divine prerogative that can be given to another, and that's generally Mark's view about what is going on here. If Mr. Rogers was right, the author could have just dropped a drumbeat through the book, and therefore Jesus is God, and therefore he's the Almighty, and therefore he's the one true God, and things like this. Bizarrely, given his interpretation, all he does is call Jesus the Lord. but it's just a commonplace that you can look up in your lexicon for New Testament Greek, that one usage of Lord is for God when it's a substitute for the divine name, and another usage is it's for the one Messiah. It's a title of Christ basically. So yeah, to say that Jesus is called Lord, therefore obviously he's God here, is just to ignore that, basically.
All right.
And to claim that these things can't be authorized is very implausible.
Hey, don't interrupt the...
Sorry, man. Sorry, Marlon.
Right. It's all good. It's all good. Next question here. This is for you, Dr. Dale. All right. In Mark 6, why is Jesus water walking unparalleled in Roman myth? Water running was due to superhuman speed, but Jesus supersedes the gods, and the Roman reader is expected to be utterly astounded. What are your thoughts, Dale?
I mean, I think the reader is supposed to be astounded. That's right. I think Mark is basically working with Jewish ideas about God and humans, not with Roman ones. And when he gets into the book, he says, when he's getting near and scares them and they think it's a ghost, he says, "Hey guys, it's me. It's really just this man. It's not a ghost. It's not a god. It's the human Messiah." So I don't think Mark is in danger of misleading people into thinking that Jesus is a god in the way he presents that scene. Neither a god, much less the one true God.
All right, Anthony?
So I would agree that Mark's background here is primarily the Old Testament, and that's problematic for Dale because throughout the text, Jesus is saying and doing what God did in the Old Testament, a signature act of God. It even says that when they thought they saw a ghost, Jesus says intended to pass by them, which is an Old Testament catchphrase for what God did with Moses. He passed by him and declared his name to them. This is what Jesus does in Mark 6. He intends to pass by them, but then says to them, "I am," ego eimi in the Greek. Very clearly, Jesus is identifying himself as God in this text.
All right.
That's why they were amazed.
All right. And here's another question for Sentinel Apologetics. Thank you, Robert Rowe, for the super chats. Appreciate it. The Old Testament image of God asleep functioned as a symbol of the absoluteness of his sovereignty and sleeps undisturbed over chaos waters. In Mark 4, why was this used for Jesus asleep on the chaos waters? I think it's for you, Del.
The thing about God's power over the water, right? In ancient times, the seas were particularly scary and dangerous, and people weren't sure what was really under them. And, it says in Psalm 89, famously, "You rule the raging sea. When its waves rise, you still them." So God is provident even over this deep, scary, dark thing that, swallows up humans whenever they mess up. But in the rest of the psalm, he's talking about how he's going to bless his king, traditionally believed to be David. And he says about that king, "I will set his hand on the sea and his right hand on the rivers." Right? So the authority over the waters is being given to God's anointed one. And right, this is why, just because it's normally a divine prerogative, this is just yet another case of something you would normally think was reserved for God alone. Oh, but actually God can share it. This is just another example of this. And again, go read the passage about Jesus walking on the water and try to find the part where the narrator, a good character, a bad character, anybody concludes, aha, that's God himself. They don't conclude it because it doesn't follow. It just follows that this is a miracle that's been done.
All right, Anthony, any thoughts?
Yeah, his appeal to Psalm 89 is erroneous. And when it says that he'll set his hand on the sea, it's and of course the ends of the earth, it's referring to his, coming to have dominion over all the world, meaning the people on it. But the idea of God sleeping in the Old Testament and awakening to still the winds and the waves, that is ascribed to Yahweh. Isaiah 51, 9-11 says, "Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord, as in the days of old. Was it not you who dried up the sea?" So repeatedly, God is called upon to awaken and subdue the sea. That's what happens in Mark chapter 4, not Mark 6, by the way, where Jesus is asleep on the boat and they awaken him to come and still the sea. So it's very clearly an Old Testament notion ascribed to Yahweh that's here being ascribed to Jesus. And by the way, in Job 9, it explicitly says that God alone tramples down the waves of the sea, and the Septuagint says he walks upon the sea as upon a floor. Later in the same context, Job says, if he were to pass by me, I would not recognize him. The very thing that's happening in Mark chapter 6, when the disciples don't recognize him but think they see a ghost, when Jesus intends to pass by him. Okay, these things all have Old Testament counterparts. They are identifying Jesus as the Lord, as the I am, what Jesus explicitly says in the text.
All right. And here's another super chat from Sentinel Apologetics. Thank you once again, Robert. Appreciate you. Roman medical text spoke of men as non-porous hard bodies. In Mark 5, why did Jesus contradict this by showing his male body was porous and soft, curing the woman in order to show his hidden divinity? That's for you, Dale.
I have no idea.
Anthony, you
If he wants to take it, go for it.
What you got?
Yeah, I'm not necessarily informed about this particular question, though it's intriguing. My mind is racing a little bit here. But one thing I would say about these miracles, throughout the Old Testament, according to the law, if you touch an unclean person, you're rendered unclean. The law itself couldn't affect cleansing. Only the Holy One could make what was unclean holy. And Jesus, throughout Mark's gospel, is presented as that Holy One. He touches lepers without becoming clean, and his touch cleanses them. It doesn't just speak of him healing them, it speaks of him actually touching them. It's deliberate. The woman who has the menstrual discharge for many years touches him, and yet she's cleansed rather than Jesus becoming unclean. Jesus touches the dead body of the Syrophoenician woman's daughter, even though touching a corpse renders one unclean. So here's Jesus repeatedly trumping the Torah, just like he declares all foods clean in Mark chapter 7. Just like Jesus walks among the tombs when he delivers the Gerasene demoniac from a demon without becoming unclean and shows his power over Satan's legions. Repeatedly, Jesus is being presented in all of this not only as the Holy One, but as the strong man predicted in the Old Testament. Isaiah 40 and 42 all repeatedly speak of God as the strong one. And there it's talking about his coming new Exodus work to rout the evil one and deliver mankind from Satan's oppression. So Jesus is being presented as Yahweh in so many different ways in Mark's gospel that it takes, and I'm not just trying to be mean here, but it does take a special kind of blindness to miss it.
All right.
Marlon, all I would say about this passage is that when the woman touches him and he doesn't know who touched him, this once again shows that he's not the essentially omniscient God. And you can't, suppose here that he's saying he doesn't have the authority to declare who touched him. He doesn't know. He looks around to see who does it. Right? God wouldn't need to do that.
All right. And this is a follow-up. I think he was explaining, this is Robert Rowe again, Sentinel Apologetics. Mark 5, the power goes through Jesus' body to cure. I think that's what he's talking about as far as the porous nature of the body, I guess. That's what he's referring to. So, all right. Thank you, Robert, for that explanation. Thank you for the super chat. Appreciate you, buddy. All right. Where am I at? I have another one here somewhere. Here it is. All right. This question is for Dr. Tuggy again. Thank you for the super chat, Joseph. It says, is Jesus divine now, and will we be divine due to possessing divine attributes such as eternal life and having a divine nature? Does divine equal God?
In early Christianity, they talk about human salvation as divinization or being made gods and so on. Of course, they don't mean being made divine in the way that the one true God is divine. They seem to mean something like being made immortal and being, entirely freed from sin and things like this. So you could say that Jesus is in a divine position or has a kind of divine status now. I believe that when he's exalted and given a new job, he had to be given capabilities appropriate to that new job, which would include a big upgrade in power and knowledge versus what he had in his earthly ministry. But I don't, what I reject from the patristics is this idea that, to divinize us, Jesus has to be divine, like divine in what sense? Like in the way one God is divine. There's no idea anywhere in the New Testament. It's never implied, never presupposed, never stated that to atone or to reconcile us to God, Jesus has to be divine in order to accomplish that.
All right, Anthony, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I'd say a major problem here for Dale, in light of, saying there's maybe some sense in which he could be divine afterwards when he's given all these things. The problem is Jesus has and exercises all of these prerogatives prior to his resurrection: the authority to forgive sins, the authority to read the hearts of men. I mean, and it doesn't even speak of that as authority. It's just a power that he has. But moreover, I mean, you even see Jesus as omniscient in the New Testament. Contrary to Dale, Mark 5 is not an example of Jesus being ignorant of who touched him. In Mark 5, the whole point of the story is that Jesus knew that somebody touched him, and it wasn't just some it wasn't just that somebody touched him and he didn't know who it was. The Greek, it's obscured in our translations, but the Greek literally says that he turned to see. It's an infinitive of purpose, the woman who had touched him specifically. So Jesus knew immediately in his spirit, it says, that he was touched, and he turned for the purpose of seeing the woman who had touched him. So he's not being presented as ignorant there, but as all-knowing, just like God is all-knowing, and that long before the resurrection, long before this quasi-divinization that Dale believes in.
All right.
What he gets in Revelation 5 is real.
You get to respond, and so do I.
Okay.
Okay,
All
fine.
right,
What he gets in Revelation 5 is real. It's a real upgrade of position, just like Daniel 7. And the text you were just talking about and mischaracterized, verse 32, says, he looked all around to see who had done it. And then the woman comes up and fesses up.
Yeah, and what you're missing is to see is an infinitive of purpose. And it doesn't just say he looked, it's not saying he looked around to find out who it was. It says he looked around to see.
That's
for the
exactly
purpose
what
of
it says.
seeing the woman who touched him. So he knew that it was the woman, not just some unnamed
You've got a
figure in
theory
the
and you're
crowd.
just fighting
That's
the translators.
why the disciples
now.
are amazed.
You're fighting all the translators.
All right, guys.
You're fighting the Greek text. There's only one person who knows Greek here, Dale, and it's me, not you.
All right, guys. Let's press on because we got several more questions here. All right, this is from Josiah Batista. I appreciate you. This is for Aaron Rodgers. You said how God saved Israel through the water, full well knowing he did this thing through a man. Why can't the same be true of the Messiah in Acts chapter 2, verse 22?
Yeah, the problem you have in trying to look at it this way is it's only giving one half of the equation. I certainly grant that God was active in the Old Testament, and so were men. What happens in the New Testament, though, is what's ascribed to those men in the Old Testament is ascribed to Jesus, and what was ascribed to God in the Old Testament is ascribed to Jesus. So Jesus ends up being the embodiment both of those human types as well as the divine Lord in all of these encounters. And so, for example, while Moses was involved in delivering the people through the sea, it's God who rebukes the sea, according to the Old Testament text. It's Jesus who rebukes the sea, according to the New Testament text. So Jesus fulfills the role not only of the human types of the Old Testament, but the divine Lord of the Old Testament. So Jesus is, contra Dale's 17th century Socinianism, being presented as both God and man in the New Testament, in Mark specifically.
Dale,
what a lot of Trinitarians will tell you is that in the New Testament, Jesus actually does miracles not by exercising his divine nature or exercising his divine powers, but rather through the power of God's Spirit that's given to him. And this is what we see in places like Luke 4, the Spirit of the Lord is on me. John, he says, God gives the Spirit without measure to the Messiah. So yeah, there's this background assumption that, yeah, God is empowering all of this, and it's understood to be kind of a divine, like it argues in John, it's a kind of divine endorsement that he really is who he says he is, which is God's Christ. This idea that Jesus does miracles, and this shows that he has divine powers, is nowhere to be found in the book. There's not a shred of it anywhere. The author could have told you 74 different times, and he just passes it all by. That's because he doesn't think that.
Mark 1:3. Mark 2:28.
All right, guys.
Mark 5:19.
All right,
where he doesn't say
another
that.
question.
Right.
Here's another question for Dell. All right, for Dell. Thank you for the super chat, Walter. Appreciate you, man. How do you explain Jesus claiming to be the root and offspring of David if he's merely a human creature?
The root and the offspring of David. I mean, I take it that's a way of saying that he's from the line of David, which is a, kind of a pan New Testament view about him. Do you think I guess the question maybe presupposes that he's supposed to be like the creator of David or something like that, but I don't think that's the meaning of the phrase.
All right, Anthony, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. It seemed like this is the first time Dale sort of thought about that, and he was sort of naturally inclined to think, oh, is this saying that Jesus is the origin of David as well as his offspring? And that's exactly right. That's how I would take that. And it's similar to what's going on in Mark 12, to bring it back to the book, where Jesus asks, how could he be David's son if he's David's Lord? In other words, Jesus is both the root of David and David's offspring. And this is the reason why Jesus is not only presented as having the Spirit as a man and doing things as a man, which we would expect of the Messiah, but also doing things that only the Lord can do. Again, Dale keeps appealing to things outside of Mark's gospel to give us an impression of what he thinks Mark is telling us. He appeals to Luke, he appeals to John. But if we turn to those other gospels and incorporate into our understanding of Jesus what they additionally tell us, then we also have to take into account the rest of what they tell us. Jesus is not simply presented as as a human being who has the Spirit, according to John. He's a divine person, come in the flesh, anointed as a human being to do those things that were necessary for man's salvation. I think Mark is doing that in his own distinctive way, and he presents Jesus repeatedly as the Lord, explicitly. It's not encoded. It's not obscure. He doesn't say through the Lord. He says he is the Lord, and he's doing what the Lord did, and he does it in exactly the way the Lord did it, and in exactly the same order, using the exact and precise terminology used for God in the Old Testament.
All right. And here's another question for you, Anthony. Another super chat. Thank you, Kritik. Kritik. I'm not sure I pronounced your name right. I'm sorry if I mispronounced it. Thank you for the super chat. Anthony, Mark 12:32. How many persons is in this verse? 1, 2, or 3, or more? Asking for a friend.
Yeah, so the great thing about Mark 12, just to give something of the context here, in Mark 12, you have Jesus being tested. There's a series of tests, right? The Herodians, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and in each case, Jesus thoroughly refutes them, and then they shut their mouths, right? So at this point in the discussion, he's already silenced two other groups, and now the scribe comes forward and asks the question, what's the greatest commandment? Jesus says, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And then Jesus, we're told, gives a correct answer, and they no longer dare to ask him any questions. But then it's Jesus' turn, and Jesus now asks them the question based on Psalm 110, who is the Messiah? Whose son is he? And he quotes Psalm 110:1. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. And so what's going on in the context is that the Shema most certainly does say that the Lord is one. But that's not all the Old Testament teaches us. That's not exclusive of another person who is properly and truly identified as Lord. In Psalm 110, there are two persons who are called Lord. So the one Lord who is to be worshiped and served by Israel encompasses this other person who is also called Lord. That's what's going on there. That's why at the end of that conversation, it says that Jesus had thoroughly silenced them and they no longer dared to ask him any questions.
All right, Dale, any thoughts?
Yeah, the misreading of Psalm 110 is brutal. Only one of those two who are called Lord there is the one God, and it's the one who's addressing, quote, my Lord, and kind of inviting him up to his throne and giving him all this power and so on. And so that's how all the New Testament writers take it. See Acts 2, for instance. And by the way, when I appeal to other New Testament books, it's for first century context. The answer to why David calls him Lord is because he's going to be exalted to be the one Lord, like it says, God has made him both Lord and Christ. And the scribes do not know this about the Messiah. They think he's a descendant of David, but they don't really realize how high and mighty his destiny is. And so that's how he stumps them. But to think that both of these ones called Lord in Psalm 110:1 are supposed to be God is just a brutal misreading. And this angel of the Lord stuff doesn't help with that.
All right. Another question here. We got a couple more questions and we are going to shut this thing down. Thank you for the super chat. God's true. This is for both of you. In Mark 1:24, the demons refer to Jesus as the Holy One of God. Is this a reference to the deity of Christ? Whoever want to take a shot at it first.
No, it's not. It's a reference to him being God's Holy One, God's chosen one for a special purpose, which is to say God's Christ or his Messiah, son of David, etc.
All right.
Yeah,
Anthony?
so I've already commented on this to some extent. Now, there's no question that Jesus is distinguished from the Father there. He's the Holy One of God. But that doesn't preclude that Jesus is himself God and Lord, as Mark explicitly teaches. Mark's not a Unitarian, and he fits quite comfortably in his first century Jewish context where they didn't think God was monopersonal. Throughout the Old Testament, God is declared to be the Holy One. It's God's feet that touch the ground and cause it to be holy. Exodus 3, Joshua 5. God is the one whose touch makes things holy. Throughout, Jesus goes and cleanses the land of the unclean spirits. He cleanses the leper. He cleanses the dead body of the Syrophoenician woman, of the woman in Mark 5 who has the issue of blood. Jesus is the one who's described as the Holy One throughout Mark, and in that way he is being identified as the Lord of the Old Testament. And by the way, speaking of Jesus as Lord, I have not at all, though Dale has, butchered Psalm 110. In Psalm 110, it says, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand." The one seated at his right hand is called Adonai in Psalm 110:5, an exclusive divine title. So the Lord at Yahweh's right hand is Adonai, a divine person. That's why he stumped the Jews.
Brutal misreading. Look at what the commenters say about verse 5. That's all.
Look at what the Hebrew text says, Dale. Forget the commentators.
Total misunderstanding.
And the commentators aren't on your side here.
They are on my side.
How about the Hebrew text?
That's what they're commenting on.
Real quick, two more questions, two more super chats, and we're gonna shut it down. So real quick, if you guys can champ through these last two questions. This for you, Dr. Tuggy. You said at the beginning, because Jesus asked who touched him in Mark and Luke, he can't be God. God asked Adam and his wife where they were hiding in Genesis 3. So God isn't omniscient in Eden either.
If you're going to take that story literally, you're probably going to think that he's just saying that for their benefit, basically. Hey, where are you guys? Unless you think that in a theophany he can temporarily limit his omniscience or something like that. But what I find plausible is that God, as a perfect being, is not only all-knowing. There's no truth that could be hidden from him, even in principle. He's essentially all-knowing. And so a sure way to communicate that somebody is not God in this Jewish context is to portray them as not knowing something. And that's what I think Mark has done. If you think Mark presents him as divine in some way, okay, but then that way doesn't require all that the highest sort of divinity requires, because it doesn't require essential omniscience.
All right, Anthony.
Yeah, so I've already argued on the basis of the Greek text itself, the fact that it uses the infinitive to see and specifies that it was the woman he turned to see, shows that Jesus was not saying he's ignorant, but in fact demonstrating that he's omniscient. That's why the disciples are puzzled in the context. Well, how are you asking who touched you? You see the crowd pressing in on you. So they don't understand why he knows that in fact he was touched. And the text explicitly says he was immediately aware in his spirit that somebody touched him. So the text isn't communicating
but not
his
who
ignorance,
it was.
but his knowledge, his prescience, divine knowledge. Quit interrupting me, Dale. That's my job. But Dale doesn't help himself by saying, in the Old Testament, God was just being rhetorical for the benefit of Adam and Eve, saying, where are you? To elicit their response. It does the very same thing in Mark 5. Jesus elicits a response from the disciples, which draws attention to the fact that he knows something they don't think he should know. So I think he's just basically made my point for me.
He looked all around to see who had done it. Verse 32.
He didn't look around in order to find out, Dale. He looked around to see the woman who had touched him. So he knew who touched him, according to the Greek.
All right. And this is the final question of the debate. Appreciate the super chat. Appreciate it. To both. Is there a correlation between Psalms 110:1 and Hebrews 1 and the reference to Jesus as Lord? Anthony?
Well, of course. I mean, Psalm 110 is quoted numerous times in the New Testament, among them Mark 12, what we've talked about, as well as Hebrews 1. Throughout Hebrews 1, the author cites a litany of Old Testament texts establishing the full deity of the coming Messiah. He's explicitly called God in verse 8, Hebrews 1:8, and he's called Lord in verse 1:10, the Lord who made heaven and earth. He's even identified as immutable there, unchanging, unlike the rest of the world in Hebrews 1:10. And so after that, he cites Psalm 110 in the context of this litany of Old Testament deity text applied to Jesus. It's this same context in which Jesus is said to be the effulgence of God's glory, the exact representation of his nature, and also says that he is the one through whom God created the world and is the one by whose word, powerful word, all things are being upheld. So that's all found in Hebrews chapter 1. And that just supports my interpretation of Mark 12 in its citation of Psalm 110, and again, thoroughly debunks Dale's claims.
All right,
Wouldn't that be
Dale?
nice? Yeah, Hebrews 1 is thoroughly throughout distinguishing Jesus from God. It would be pointless to argue that the Son has now been made superior to the angels if he has the divine essence or is the one God. He is called God, quoting Psalm 45, but then he's described as having a God. So that shows you that, like the term Lord is ambiguous, the term God is ambiguous. Lord can mean a title of the one God or a substitute for the divine name, and it can also be applied to others, such as Jesus in the whole New Testament. There's something interesting going on with verse 10 and 11 and 12 when he's quoting a psalm which clearly was originally about God. And I think, based on research, that it's best to take this as a reapplication like the ones that I described. Anthony Buzzard has a good appendix in his book called Jesus is Not a Trinitarian, where he's quoting some recent biblical scholarship about this very subject and about just quite what the author of Hebrews 1 is doing with this Old Testament quotation, what he means by it. And of course, he doesn't mean that Jesus is the one God himself. He distinguishes Jesus from the one God himself through the whole book. Even if you think that verse 1 or verse 2 is saying that God created all things through Jesus, well, that's not something that you'd say about God, that someone else created through him. He's supposed to be the ultimate source of God's creation. So you would get pre-existence that way. You wouldn't get Jesus being the one God if that's what that statement means. I don't think it does, but that's another conversation.
All right.
All things are through the Father, Romans 11:36.
All right,
Yes.
guys.
Father, not God.
I agree with that text.
All right, guys. Thank you guys for that. That was a great debate, and I think the audience really enjoyed it. And I love getting guys on. And Dale, I think I sent you a gift. Did you get that gift? I think it was like a year ago now. I think you got it, right?
Yes, it was
Okay.
it was a book. Appreciate it.
Okay, cool. All right. So Anthony, because you're a newcomer to the Gospel Truth, you get a gift, man. And I'm going to be contacting you after the show to get your address and everything to get that gift over to you. Just a thank you from me to you for taking time out your schedule to come on the show and entertain my followers, man, and give a good debate. So I appreciate you both, man. I'm going to get this thing closed out. You guys take care and God bless. All right.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Marlon.
Anthony.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Marlon.
Dale.
All right.
God bless.